Good morning. I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. It was a wonderful opening ceremony if you had a chance to be down there with Mary Tarango. And I think it reflects the cultural values that our people carry, in that when you're in someone else's homeland, that they welcome you. And so it was beautiful to see that traditional practice here at the university. Well, again, good morning. My name is Connie Reitman, and I've been asked to be here this morning, and I'm joyful to be here this morning because I think we're embarked on a really transformational, transitional type of endeavor that is so important for us to do as people of this community, of this country, and that is to recognize what is the history of our nation. Because if we don't know the history of our nation, then we don't know how we need to change or how we can continue to stabilize and shore up those things that are of value to us. So one of those things has been for us as tribal people as sharing what our experiences have been. Because if you don't know what the experience of a group of people is, how can you interact with them appropriately and in a good way? And so part of that is why I've dedicated pretty much of my life for about 45 years in working in community development in tribal communities. And I've had the honor to work with a lot of elders who had a lot of experience from being in the boarding schools. How many of you heard about boarding schools? Yay, that's a great start. Although for a lot of people it was a trauma experience. And that trauma lasted not just for a year, 2 years, but for decades. And what we know came out of that is what we consider today intergenerational trauma. And so intergenerational trauma has a way of wearing down and wearing out what can happen to a group of people over a period of time. And so that's why even as recently as a couple years ago, we had an incident here at the university where the thoughts of someone coming from a different cultural perspective was not acceptable in the structure that we have. And so we have to open the doors to maybe there's a different way that we can structure ourselves so that we can grow. And this is, I think, is what this event represents too, is that opportunity to grow. You folks mold the mind of our youth, mold the mind of other thinkers. And so it's so important to really look at what some of the information and some of the history, how that can help you mold those young minds, mold those young hearts, the spirit. So we've been working with professors, the doctors, and the teachers here at the university about looking at bringing forth more accurate information about the historical experiences of tribal people, specifically in California. And not to say that these types of experiences haven't happened anywhere else, but the way that they happened in California framed a lot of how we educate, inform today. And so we want to change some of the dynamics of that. And again, that's why you're here today again. So what we're working on is looking at a system-wide engagement, outreach and engagement of tribal communities. And so I work for an organization that has membership of about 50 of the 111 tribes in the state of California. And we're working to help the various universities outreach and engage their local tribal communities. Because one of the approaches we feel is so important is that you be informed, and that informed level comes from the group of people within your community. And that's how we look at it as tribal people. We want to inform those within our tribal community. That's how it's always been. So that's what we want to share with the university system. We've identified tribal communities throughout the state of California, and those individuals, tribal people in those different communities, hopefully will be working and engaged with the universities in their communities. I think that's a wonderful, even just thinking about that possibility is just an enormous task in itself. But the key, I think, is the interest and dedication and commitment of the many tribal people that I've had the honor to work with over the years, and know that you and other people that are working to try and change the dynamics of education around American Indians, you will have a good resource. And we can work with you to support your efforts to create and be more informed to create that change. So I want to welcome you all this morning and thank you for being here. And we have other folks that are going to join us today to make this a really fulfilling, rounded event. Thank you.
I felt inspired to put that up. That's a publication here in California about California Native people, and it was a special edition for the mission system. So I thought that might be appropriate for the moment, at least while I'm speaking. My name is Gregg Castro. I'm Totral Salinan, Rumsien, and first I want to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the people and of the land that we're on here today. Nisan Maidu is the confluence area, as I understand it. So one thing that's important, that's central to why we're here, that the preponderance of people in California don't realize we're still here. So what I like to do, if I have the opportunity, is ask if there are California Native people in the community, in the audience, and have them stand up and be acknowledged. So, California Native people, please. And as often happens, there's a lot more of us than you think. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I didn't put it up just because I have an article in it, but it's pertinent to what I'm saying today. When I was a child, I grew up knowing who I was, which isn't always the case. Part of the history we talk about is that the newcomers tried to take our history, our culture, our identity away from us. But I was fortunate within my family. I knew who I was, both from my mother and my father. My father's people are the Salinan people from around San Antonio Mission. And when I was a child, I used to go there often. And in my child's mind, I could see the disconnect because I saw this edifice of this beautiful mission had been restored in the 1940s. And yet way off to the side was this brick wall surrounding an area of ground full of weeds. And next to it was a sign that said, Indian Cemetery, 1808. In my young child's mind, I thought, there's 1,800 people in there. That area is about twice the size, so actually maybe only 50% bigger than the room we're in. So 1,800 people in there. And how did they get there? And how come they aren't in the other cemetery where there's nice little crosses and things? And my dad really couldn't explain it well other than that's what happened to our people. When I grew up and became involved in my tribe, I learned a deeper truth. I learned more of our history, the nuances of our history. And one of the things I learned is that that number was a date, not a number. But the actual number of people there was closer to 4,000, stacked like firewood. And how come people didn't know that? How come people didn't realize that was the history of our people? And it was replicated. My mother's people came from Carmel Mission, the headquarters. One of my ancestors was a newcomer who married one of the young girls from the local tribe. He's buried inside with honors, inside the basilica. She's buried under a tree outside in an unmarked grave. That's our history. That's what, if you're lucky to know even that much. In my work of being supportive to many communities in California, at the California Indian Conference, I started to hear Native people not waiting for history to change, but for us to change history. Redefine history, reframe how it's being presented, presenting our part of history. I am not an educator. I'm not an academic. I'm just a tribal person who grew up with that memory, and I wanted to do something about it. So I helped facilitate bringing some Native people together, some academics, some educators together. And what we came up with is this coalition. And it came at a good time because now the framework has changed. I am honored to know elders who have been working on this issue since the 1970s. Tirelessly working and not getting a lot of traction. But they laid the groundwork and the foundation for what we're doing now. And finally things are coming together. We're seeing a change. We're seeing the public being receptive to that change. And you're the focal point for that. Our young people need to know this history. There are many ways it can be presented, many levels of sensitivity, many levels of details and accuracy. But it's truth. And that truth needs to get out there in a way that it never has in California history. So I thank you and very grateful for you to be in here. Hopefully you'll spread the word. We're going to have some online resources also available. You can share those. One thing I often do when I do presentations is a fog song. We don't have time for that. But one reason my people have it is to clear the fog away. And I use that when I do presentations because we all have a fog of the mind and our heart. And so I want you to clear that fog out, which is a little bit easier in Sacramento than Monterey, and be open to what you hear. As teachers, I know a lot of you have that built in. That's why you're here. That's why we welcome you, and we're thankful and grateful for that. Thank you very much.
So, hi, my name is Mimi Coughlin, and I'm a teacher educator here at Sacramento State. And I would like to welcome you just on behalf of the College of Education as well as the university. And I'd like to introduce my colleague.
Hi, I'm Stacey Greer. I'm the director at the History Project at UC Davis, and we do teacher professional development in history social sciences.
And between the two of us, we, in some ways represent some of the institutional places here in the Sacramento Davis area where people come to learn, and so and become lifelong learners in their teaching. And so what we are going to do is we have pens from each of our institutions, and we're going to, as a gesture, give them to our elders, to the California Indians and Native people who are helping us be lifelong learners and are writing the stories and the history that we want to do a better job of getting out to teachers so that they can do a better job with the children in their classrooms.
So we at UC Davis and the History Project are learners, and we're happy to be new partners on this coalition, and we want to honor your voices and your perspectives and honor our partnership by these gifts of pens.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Oh, wait a minute.
Sorry.
It's an in your way. We have to do an even exchange.
Okay. This is new to us, obviously.
And so, as I said, we need your help in this. Our voice has been quiet by design and by purpose. We need allies within the American system to do that. So we welcome this opportunity to work with you, and it seems like a good time, such a good time to do it. So we have these little necklaces, and I think this one works better with your outfit.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm honored to wear it. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Do you want me to start, or do you want to?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Great.
All right.
So, actually, I may need you, Rose, to help wake it up so I can start the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
Nice job. Thank you. So I'll just start introducing myself and how we are part of this coalition. As I mentioned, I'm Stacey Greer. I'm the director of the History Project at UC Davis. I'm also alumna of Sac State. I have my master's in history from here, and I got my teaching credential here. And I taught for almost a decade teaching middle school and high school history before I started participating in the history project as a participant, and then they suckered me in and started asking me to present, and then lo and behold, I started working for the project as a coordinator for a number of years. I did take a short break. I went to work for the California Department of Education as the consultant on social science for professional learning, and that gave me a lot of insight into the work and the guidance documents that we have working on. So, thank you. Let me just, I just need to get this going. I think that should do it. Technology, it's awesome when it works. Let's see if that works. There we go. So we are a collaboration out of the history department at UC Davis, and we are all about teachers teaching teachers. We work with the scholars in the history department primarily, although we're branching out to other departments. We also work with the scholars here at Sac State, primarily because we're a regional group, but also because of our close relationships. And a number of the scholars here were my advisors, and I took courses from them, and it's really nice. And sometimes, don't tell this to the folks at UC Davis, but sometimes professors at CSUs can explain things better than some of the academics at UC Davis who are embedded in their research. Shh, I didn't say that out loud. We have wonderful scholars who are great teachers at UC Davis too. But we work also with the community colleges, and some of those folks also work with us. But we don't think of it as one way where scholars are just telling teachers what to teach and giving them more information. We also see it as two ways. We have conversations about teaching that the scholars don't usually often get in their preparation or PhD programs. So it's a really wonderful program. We also invite graduate students. But our main goal is to help teachers improve their craft, because some of you aren't specialists in history, some of you may be, but trying to help teachers think about what's the best way to teach history rather than rote memorization out of a textbook, but what are some of the practices of that. And we're not alone. We're actually part of a statewide network. We have 5 sites currently. We're going to be adding a 6th site soon. And part of this whole community of the California History Social Science Project is we have sites at Berkeley, UCLA, Dominguez Hills, and Irvine currently. And we do a lot of work up and down the state. And our main state office is coincidentally located across the hall at UC Davis as well, so we have a great relationship with them. But they were also the lead authors of the new framework. So we have a new framework that came out. They were hired by the State Board of Education, although all the payments came in 2008, and then they stopped, and they didn't get paid for the new versions. But they felt so passionate that they wanted to bring the work that the guidance documents up to date and infused with new scholarship and new thoughts on teaching pedagogy. So that's crucial to understand that we had an integral part in playing in this. And just to be clear, the state guidance documents come out of the State Board of Education, and we got the standards in 1998, and as many of you know, it's a very specific, detailed list of things to do. That's from 1998, and I'll go a little bit back about that history. And then all of a sudden we have Common Core and ELD standards, and they tell us to teach with inquiry. They tell us to teach about argument and evidence and claims and how we're going to support that. I think in below 5th grade it's more opinion-based, but it's the same idea. And so now we have to figure these two things out. And the framework came in and brings this together, but it also came up with updated scholarship. They couldn't drop the standards, but they were allowed to push against the standards, expand them, and bring them a little bit up to date. So you'll still see conversations where you'll still see the standards kind of embedded in the framework, but expanded or brought more up to date, and a lot of direction to integrate these two documents into what we're doing. So the other thing I want to emphasize is that while these are guidelines from the state, somebody asked me the other day, are we legally required to teach everything in there? No, these are guidance documents. Each school district's school board can decide how much of the documents they want to adopt. So some school districts are not adopting the whole thing. Most just say, okay, yes, this is where we're going to head. And then also, a lot of districts still leave it up to the teachers for how you're going to address what's in the framework. And I know as elementary school teachers, you have a lot of other subjects to do. So you have to also prioritize how much time each of the subjects are getting, and that's not always even, depending on your district or your community needs. But these are not requirements. This district decides what the actual requirements are. And again, many just say, yeah, these are the requirements, but give you some flexibility. A little history of the framework. Back in 1998, there was this big push for guidance in what we teach. Before that, it was not as clear. So this framework came out in 1998, about 10 years before the standards movement. So if anybody remembers that, I wasn't quite teaching quite then, but the old frameworks actually were a narrative about what was in there. So it was kind of like almost like a textbook reading of what was in the content. And then the standards movement came out in 1998, and so they actually pulled standards from the original document. So the standards actually represent, if you look at 1988, the Cold War is still happening here. It's not quite over. So this is Cold War thinking that are in the 1998 standards and are very different. But the other interesting thing is that the adopting frameworks and then what follows the frameworks are instructional materials, guidance on textbooks. And those go together, and that's written into state law that you can keep updating those on a cycle. The frameworks are not. The standards are not. The standards come out with one piece of legislation saying, you need standards in history. And then we've never been able to pass another piece of legislation to update the standards. But the framework can keep going. But the standards have stayed still. So just to kind of clarify why we're stuck with the 1998 standards, we can't get legislation through to be signed to update the standards, because it's very controversial. I'll explain that a little bit. So then in 2008, as part of the normal cycle, our organization was hired to start writing the new framework in 2008. So they got a whole draft out, and then in 2009, the draft is ready to go out to the public, and the recession hits. And they say, stop all activity. So they put a hiatus on that, but if you recall from the previous slide, 2010, Common Core standards come out, the ELC standards come out right after that. So all of a sudden the state says, oh, okay, we can start updating new frameworks in ELA and ELD, and then in math. And our community started arguing that we should get our framework up to date because we were next in line. So we got to start again in 2014 with no more funds. So they just got to do it voluntarily. And finally, we had, between 2014, the new version, but they had to incorporate the Common Core now. And so you'll see the document very different. You will see throughout the document inquiry questions to help guide students through the curriculum. Also, recommendations on how you can have literacy support to help your students access and engage with their sources, prepare arguments or opinion papers and that type of thing, and then support for English learners. In this process, though, I also want to articulate that there were over 11,000 public comments on this document. If people argue that nobody cares about history, those 11,000 comments obviously say differently. But those are members of the public who all care about having their history told more accurately, or at least from their perspective, more accurately. So the document was out. Other frameworks, the highest rating was about 400 comments. So you can see the difference in what kind of comments we got in history. So extensive revisions went through. The State Board of Education had a panel called the Instructional Committee Quality Commission, and they took and reviewed every comment that came through and decided what they were going to do with it. So it was a lengthy process, but we now have a document. And so the document is both a mixture of what academics at the universities thought, as well as the public, as well as members of the State Board of Education and the IPC, all that kind of blended together. So it is a public document. It is a document that reflects many interests. Important in the document is that it reflects the state superintendent's principles about what the California way is. And of these, which is important for our work today, is really a celebration of diversity, inclusive and culturally relevant, and inquiry-based instruction. I think you'll see that throughout the framework, that it is not trying to tell a narrow vision of history, but expansive. And I also want to reiterate that where certain groups of people may be listed, that's not to say that is all you can teach, but that is the, mentioning those who asked or were, advocating to be in the framework, but we want to be inclusive. So if your students need to know about different groups that are not specifically mentioned in the framework in some specific place, you're not prohibited from teaching those. you're encouraged to do what your community needs. So to be expansive. Of course, that leaves a lot of decisions up to you and means that there's a lot of work to be done. So I'm going to skip over this, but as I mentioned, we have expanded content. Well, I guess I'm not skipping over it, just going to do it briefly. Expanded content, inquiry disciplinary skills, thinking about how we read sources, literacy and language, and a new focus on citizenship. But thinking of citizenship broadly, not thinking about who's legal and who's not legal, but how we prepare our students to be civically engaged in our community, be proponents of be ready to leave our school system and ready to engage in their democratic principles and be advocates for their community and their needs. So all of these together are what we're trying to say is the way we want to promote teaching of history, social sciences. Okay, and as I mentioned, the inquiry cycle is really important. You've probably seen something like this at some place where you're thinking about how we do that. But when we talk about evidence, we want to be broad-minded on that. Obviously, that includes text-based sources, primary and secondary, but those sources also include artifacts and images and music and drama, as well as oral history. We want to think about those sources and how we're going to help students grapple with evidence from those sources. So we want to have an expansive idea of what evidence means in history social science. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions before I kind of go over what's in the 2 grade levels that we're talking about. Maybe could you help me pass these out? So what I'm passing out are the excerpts from the California History Social Science Framework that came out in 2016. The excerpts from 3rd and 4th grade that provide opportunities, whether explicit or implicit, to teach about California Indian peoples. So it's both where the framework actually mentions their history and places where it's open-ended enough that we can weave in the history even if it's not explicitly mentioned. Okay? I'm not going to ask you to read all this. I wanted to give this to you so you can reference it later because I don't want to put all this text up on my slide. I don't like to read them. But talking about 3rd grade, how many of you are 3rd grade teachers? Okay, wonderful. This may not look all that different from what you're already familiar with, but we just want to recap what's in the 3rd grade framework and where you can have opportunities to teach about California Indian peoples. Obviously, we start talking with geography, and then we move into American Indians of the local region. So that's going to be different depending on where you live. And then as we go forward, though, it may not be as explicit, but there are opportunities to teach about California Indians, bringing the history up to the present day, that you have those opportunities because it's open-ended in that way. For example, when we're talking about the California Indians of the local region, a couple of quotes I wanted to emphasize is that we want to talk about that it's most appropriate that we present, we authentically present about the California Indians' history that live in the region. So we want to make sure that it is appropriate, that they are authentically presented, and that the framework actually recommends that local California Indian tribes and organizations are important sources of information. So we don't want to have the information only coming from the textbook or only coming from one perspective, but we can invite and welcome California Indian tribes that are in our communities in to meet with us and to help guide our curriculum and to speak to students. I think it's really powerful that you can do that. So as I mentioned, there's inquiry questions throughout the framework, and one here is who were the first people in my community? So kind of focusing on that and giving extensive recommendations there. Now, that's where it's really explicit, is talking about them before contact, before newcomers arrive. But when we look at the rest of the units, it's really there's great implicit opportunities. When we're talking about development of the local community, change over time, it's open-ended. It's covering from exploration, colonization, up to the present. So who's in our community? So if you have tribes that are in your community, that's part of bringing that up to date. So we're not just talking about people in history, but people as they live today, right? It's a really important piece. And that's true of American citizen symbols and government, and even economics of the local region. They talk about service learning projects to study issues important in their community. So these issues are still important, obviously. I don't have to convince you of that because you're here. But I want to ask you to consider ways you can present California Indians, not just before exploration, colonization, but after newcomers arrive. Okay? In 4th grade, questions on 3rd grade? Okay. Yes?
So when I'm teaching my class about California Indians, is that what I call Native Americans? Like, what is the PC? What would you recommend? That's been a big question for me.
Absolutely.
You know, the indigenous people, California. I just want to.
And I want to mention one thing, is that we're actually learners on this project. We're not experts on California Indian history at all. We're learners and trying to learn from being as part of this coalition. So I want to turn it over to the experts so that we can hear from them what, you know.
Well, I think it's a combination of things, and it's also about helping them understand what names have been used for American Indians or California Indians. And then there's like layers, too, of what that tribe's name is, what their region is, and how they relate to those regions. So that's going to change a little as you go throughout the state because our communities were varied. But there were core principles and practices that did exist, among the tribal people. But for your area, that's why we feel it's so important to make that connection to your local community because there are nuances within those communities that really will make a difference. And sometimes really just the verbiage you use really will make a difference. So it's important to feel that you can talk to, as the work is going, to the people in your community because it will vary, not significantly, but it can vary from community to community. And that's why we're looking to engage the communities within your local areas to become a resource. So it varies. I know that isn't a direct question, but or answer, but it's sort of a way that you might look at it.
If I might add, that's a common question, and it's almost generational because our honored elders often grew up with the term American Indian, then it became Native American, and now it's indigenous people for the younger people. But I think, and I think all of them are acceptable. It's kind of a real arguing point amongst Native people when they have gatherings. So I think out in the public, California Indian is acceptable. But I think it's also important if you know the local people and you don't have to necessarily have contact, they often have websites. They identify themselves. My people are the Salinan people, my other people are the Ohlone people. That's how we specifically identify ourselves in a way that the public can understand. And that's important.
And it's again tribe by tribe. So the tribes were they were nations, and so and they respected each other's areas greatly, and so it's not one size fits all. As you mentioned, yes. Yeah.
That's very helpful for 3rd grade, where at our school they study the groups that live in our county, but in 4th grade we study the groups that live in the whole state. Mm-hmm. So I say Native Californians, but I don't know.
That's acceptable.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
I believe that's my opinion.
Yes.
I'm from Canada, and the statement there when you refer to natives is First Nations people.
Right.
And I like that.
And it's starting to come down in here, but we want to acknowledge the people of Canada, so we try to educate people that that's a different term used for Canada. Yeah. Well, yeah. Although using it pervasively in First Nations context, yes, but a lot of communities use the word nation within the community as an indication of sovereignty.
So,
just a comment. I'm a docent at the State Indian Museum, and so I get this question quite often. The East Coast, you use this kind of a word, and I hear people who are deaf to the various museums across the country. Oh, you don't dare say Indian over on the East Coast, say Native American. Over here, is it okay to say Indian? And then, of course, First Nations and all of that. I just want to point out one particular practice that is common amongst our communities. And if this were all Native people here in the room, it's very common to ask, can you please identify yourself? Who are your people? And you say your name. My people are Amamutsun. We're from the Hollister area. Next person goes on like that. Or if you're from different groups. My mother is Mexican, Aztec. My father's Amamutsun. And I've become actually intertribal because I was never drawn back into my Ohlone community. Ohlone is a different word because that's a conglomeration of the 8 different dialects and groups, and probably more than in our San Francisco South Bay area. So I want to point out that that's a good practice, but it's also a good practice for everyone because we kind of identify as generic Americans, but that's hiding and disguising our European ancestry or whatever else we come from, our African ancestry or South American ancestry. So it's a tool that reveals much about all of us, not just Native Americans or the particular tribal groups in our area.
And I want to just share a perspective too, because I think one of the things that impacted us, our families, was the fact that a lot of families survived by not being acknowledged as American Indians or Native Americans. And so in some communities where that had to happen, there wasn't that, so, that pride of heritage or pride of who you were. And so a lot of people didn't for a long time identify as the tribal group that they came from. So they were other groups of people, Italian or Hispanic or from other ethnicities. But just be aware of that too, because that's part of the historical picture of impact of colonization on tribal people, is to have to hide who they were. And so sometimes when you ask that, it may not be comfortable for them to disclose who they are. So, these are just little bits and pieces that we're aware of as we work to heal in our communities. So don't be offended if someone isn't forthright, because it is a defense and protection method for our people not to disclose who they were. And so it's taking a long time for some of our families to recover and to claim who they are. So that might be a perspective you want to keep in mind too. It's not because they don't want to tell you, but there's an historical experience of the family that happened from generation to generation, and so they had to cover to protect the children. So remember that in your thinking too. It's not because people don't want to share. It's a historical survival mechanism for our people. So just a perspective. So don't be offended. And I tell that to a lot of people because if you look at it from the Native American side, you would understand why sometimes it's hard to disclose and very difficult. Yes.
For people that are here today and don't recognize the intergenerational trauma, if you go to IndianCountryToday.com on the web, they have a paper that they are dispersing for free on
Generational trauma,
which I agree with what you just said.
And I think some of this terminology is almost relatively new even in teaching centers, because the dynamics of that social action or lack of action isn't something that impacted a lot of groups of people. So it doesn't apply, so you don't see it in the standard dialogue, right? So that's why we want to share that perspective, intergenerational trauma, because it isn't something that happened just a few years, it happened for decades. So a whole different mindset when you're thinking in terms of generation after generation after generation being impacted. So just share that with you.
So thank you so much. And as we said, is that we are more experts in teaching about history than we are in any particular subject area. So, and we're just happy to be part of this coalition so that we're learning along with many of you what's the best way to address this. And I think teaching with sensitivity and being aware of these issues is important without trying to prevent us. We don't want to get so nervous that we don't teach it, that we have to be like acknowledging that it's complicated. And gloss over it or avoid it because we don't want to teach that. So thank you all for the conversation. Just briefly, because we're a little bit behind, the units in California history, I think you'll see that these are very familiar. But I think it's a little bit different when we get into what it actually says in the framework. And I'm just going to pull out a few quotes that I think are important to bring your attention to, because there's a lot more explicit mention in the fourth grade than there was in the third grade. Fourth grade, what we want to make sure that we're looking at is that we want to caution you against role-playing, simulations, and drama, as these sorts of activities can easily be perceived as insensitive. So when you're doing simulations and role-plays, you want to make sure that you're not simplifying issues so much, or that you're not downplaying some issues that could be complicated. Not to say that these aren't good activities. You just have to be sensitive and aware of what you're doing and the different perspectives and what you may be, how your students may be feeling if they are part or not part of what you're talking about. Another piece we want to talk about when we get into California missions, ranchos, and the Mexican War for Independence, I think you may have been seeing in the media and in the summit's signature campaign petition to change the mission project, that we want to avoid particular things. One thing to note is that the historical record remains incomplete due to limited documentation of Native testimony, at least of written testimony from the time. But we can get that at that testimony in different ways. But we also want to say that it's clear that Indians suffered in many, or we might say most of the, or maybe all of the California missions, and the death rate was extremely high. So these are places that we want to teach with sensitivity and careful planning to bring this history to life. And specifically on the project of studying this period is that we want to focus on the daily experience of missions rather than building structures themselves. And my director was actually very passionate about this for a long time, and you've probably heard about this in the media, but we want to avoid building sugar cubes or popsicle sticks. Does not help students, and it may be offensive. It probably is offensive to, it definitely is offensive to many people. The other thing to note on that is that when you're thinking about this time period, think about the lesson objective to building a mission. And I can't really describe what students are getting out of it except for fun with their families to putting this together. They're not learning real history. They're not really learning about architecture per se, because that's not architectural principles. They're not really doing an art project. They're not learning, they're not learning engineering. So what do they really learn from that project that is appropriate for this time period? So there's a lot of ways we can say we want to avoid that. So we want to find other ways to teach about this time period, and also to remind us that, again, history doesn't stop at the end of the missions. We can talk about how Native Californians were supposed to receive half of the mission land, but did not receive the land they were promised. So it's a complex issue that we need to teach with sensitivity. Beyond the mission period, we have many other opportunities, and the specific places that California Indians are represented in the curriculum is in the gold rush, looking at the conflicts that are happening with those speculators who are going after the land and how they treated Indian groups, and this Indian Indenture Act of 1850 that forces servitude of Indians. So these are some real calamities that are going on, and we can't whitewash it, but we need to remember how to teach it with sensitivity, especially to students. I'm guessing they're 9 and 10 years old in 4th grade, so that's complicated, but we don't want to gloss over it or glorify the missions in any way, or glorify what's happening in the gold rush, which is often taught with a heroic perspective without really looking at some of the tragedies that brought. California is an agricultural and industrial period. This is a time more like 3rd grade where you have opportunities to teach about California Indians' cultural and economic contributions as part of the diverse population from statehood to the present. So a lot of that's not specifically mentioned, but again, just because it's not mentioned doesn't mean that you shouldn't be trying to figure out ways to bring that forward. In the post-war, they actually mentioned as part of the civil rights effort, specifically the occupation of Alcatraz by California Indians. So I know that some of you don't go past statehood, but for those of you who are trying to get, kind of, California history is supposed to be from the beginnings to the present, which is a lot to teach 4th graders. If you do get forward and you are able to get into the civil rights effort, that's really important. And finally, when we're talking about governments, at the end of the framework chapter, the standards, they talk about teaching about government, and they actually recommend that we teach government throughout as we're learning about new groups. that we're studying tribal and village rules and examples of how those are structured as examples of different governments, so that we don't say that government only exists as part of the with the newcomers. Okay. Questions on 4th grade? Yes.
So your last point is wonderful, and we do have local sources for that sort of thing, but is there any kind of a statewide resource for knowing what tribal rules and laws we live in?
So I think we're at that place where there's 111, if I heard correctly, tribes in California, so they're going to be structured differently. But are there resources to see some patterns that we can talk about, or?
Tribal governments are based on policy. The Indian Reorganization Act is one of those. And that was in the 1930s that the Indian Reorganization Act was passed. So a lot of things that happened to tribes happened because of federal policy, federal and state policy. So anytime you're looking at research in terms of historical perspectives, you can find it in California laws and federal laws. So, for example, here in California, there's a book called Early California Laws and Policies Related to California Indians, and that'll tell you a lot about what happened during the 1850s in the indenturement of tribal children to settlers in our community. And if you look at history, that was the time when slavery was ending, but in California, California laws began to indenture children to settler families. So, if you look at Indian Reorganization Act, if you look at federal Indian laws, federal Indian policy, you're going to see a whole, from the 1800s up until the present, of federal laws, just federal laws alone, that impacted tribal communities. And so it's about health, it's about education, it's about governance, it's about how tribes will interact for environmental purposes, what their rights are to hunt and fish. So a lot of it's embedded in federal policy and federal law. Not that you have to do all the research on that, but that if you look it up, it'll download a whole bunch of information on a whole variety of issues. So, yeah.
That's all really important and great for understanding why things are as they are right now. But for my kids, when we're looking at the different regions, we're looking at before contact. And we'd love to know how things were organized before our laws, the state's laws were put on.
And that's why we're really encouraging of working with your local communities, because there's a lot of people within your communities that are doing this kind of work out there, but aren't being engaged. And so that's why we want to make those linkages, so you can go right literally to the horse's mouth, so to speak.
We do have local, but as far as the 4th grade teacher looking for statewide, I don't have.
Okay.
But I think you can use the local as an example and say that tribes are going to be
organized. So I was just trying to do something different with them.
Absolutely. So it's a way to kind of remind them of what they learned in 3rd grade. If your teacher's doing that, connect to it, and then say kind of extrapolate for the state. But as we learn from more resources that we're going to be putting online, we should be able to give you more resources that you can see different groups across the state that you can pull from.
So as part of this group, will we have links?
Yes, and we have that. We're going to go over that a little bit later.
Okay.
So you have actually a photocopy. It's like 3 pages, and we have about 6 different communities in which we have represented with California Indian curriculum. But I believe the document that Connie is talking about is already on there as well with the resources, so you can access it there. So we'll go over that later.
Okay. And just to wrap up briefly, I want to mention that current textbooks in your classrooms are either from 1999 or from 2005. We have to wait till a new framework is adopted before new textbooks can go through the process. And they are in the process right now. They're being debated at the State Board of Education level, and by November they will have a list of those that are recommended for your school districts. Your school districts do not have to purchase off that list, but it's easier for them to do that. And then different school districts have different levels of resources. So in the most districts who planned for this and who have the funds will be piloting textbooks next school year and purchasing the year after. But there are many school districts who are not. But I would encourage you to kind of ask about that and kind of advocate for new resources. although we're putting together other resources to supplement that process. So, any last questions? Okay. I'm going to leave this up for just a minute. If you want to contact us, we encourage you to contact us in any of these ways. So thank you so much.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I just want to say one of my things is as elementary history social science teachers, we all need resources and support and help as you're trying to give us, but we need to have the professional development around this because I've been at this for 15 years and we just do not get the love that the English language arts math people get. So that's definitely a persistent and ongoing problem. So the resources are there. There are things we can draw on, but it takes time and effort and collaboration really at the very local site of in your own classroom with your own team and your own school colleagues to really do this work. So I don't know who's listening to me who has any of the power to bring time to teachers to integrate this, but that is a major need because I've been to go to a conference and we're all here earnestly trying to do what we can, but we do need that time, that prep time to implement new curriculum. So I'm just going to put that out to the universe. Professional development, resources, and time for teachers.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Rose Borunda, and I'm part of this little misfit crowd started by Mr. Castro back there and my dear colleague, Crystal Martinez-O'Leary, who has had to take a leave of absence. But it's very courageous work that you're doing, and when we look at acquiring California innovative curriculum, we're asking of people who essentially have been told for many years that we don't value you, and now we're saying we do value you, and we want to know the right information to give out. So I appreciate that you're asking these questions, and so we want to be able to provide that safe space to ask these questions because we only know what we know. And if we were not taught correctly, as many of us were not growing up, it's difficult to know where to begin when you're now responsible for teaching the next generation. So I thank you. I thank you for being here, and I thank you for being courageous and to not be afraid to ask those questions that you were never taught the answer to. And so this void is what we're having to fill. And with that, I see it as a place of healing as we come to this place of transformation. So with that, what I'd like to do at this point, recognizing that a little bit later we're going to be looking at specific curriculum that has been given to us by tribal communities, and we'll go through the material so you'll have a sense of what's there. In the afternoon, we have Khal Schneider will be with us in a second, but we have Calvin Hedrick, who's also going to be giving us additional information after our lunch break, and he's also going to be giving us some games and activities, because what I've been hearing from teachers is we need some hands-on stuff as well. So it's not just about teaching knowledge, but it's about the experience too. So Calvin has joined us, and he's offered some information that you'll be able to use, and we'll be able to upload that information as well. So for right now, what I'd like to do is introduce the gentleman who I always say that we stole from Cal State East Bay, Dr. Khal Schneider, who I just read a paper he wrote about the experience of the Pomo people in terms of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and their survival and working together and recreating communities. It was a fantastic read. But a book that he is working on right now is called To Work My Way for Something Better. And he's addressing post-conquest, post-invasion, and how California Indian people have banded together, worked together to be to where they are right now and hopefully progressing on as well. So, Dr. Schneider? And we can clap.
Oh,
You don't need it?
no.
Thank you, Rose. Thanks to all the presenters, and of course, thank you all for being here. It's great to be here myself. So my job, as I understood it, was to give a historical overview of the California Indian experience, and I thought I would base it on and then build out from the mission. So I titled the talk "Dismantling the Mission Model." So I'm going to start with the mission model and use that in a couple different ways. Starting with this, what's been in the news in the last month or so, the fact that due to the work of people like the UCD History Project, people in this room, the History Social Science Framework has basically made the case successfully to the people of California that the standard fourth grade project of the mission model is probably needs to go away. And I was looking at how that has been covered in the press, kind of expecting there to be some pushback. Maybe there has been. I didn't see too much, at least in the major newspapers in the state. Surprisingly, at least to me anyway, it turned out that people didn't seem to like the mission project very much. We're kind of happy to see it go. So now all the objections come out, kind of recorded by the LA Times in a kind of article/editorial. And these are echoed in a bunch of other places. The quote from the LA Times was, "They're messy, they take over the dining room, parents build them anyway." So a lot of groaning jokiness to the objections to the mission project, so we've probably all heard. But then there's some more serious criticisms that emerge of that mission model project, that is building the model with the students of fourth grade. That, as expressed in the framework, it's offensive to many, and it's a poor teaching tool. It's impressive to me to see consensus, it seems, maybe it's too early to tell, build around the need to teach history better. As a historian, we'd like to see that. And it's even more surprising and impressive to me, I think, considering how closely Californians have identified with an idea of the mission, whether or not it's the accurate history of the mission or not, we can talk about, and Michelle Lorimer will talk about. But Californians have identified their own history with the history of the missions. So my goal today is not to congratulate us too quickly, but to look at how deeply entrenched this idea is in California history and California Indian history, and to point out some of the pitfalls as we go forward, because it's obviously not just a fourth grade project, the mission model. It's kind of encapsulated the public's understanding of California Indians since statehood. It's been a model for government policies, a model for understanding the place of Native people in a longer historical trajectory in California. And this has been a very confining, constraining, and limited place for Native people. So teaching this history better, I think, will involve more than just stopping one project from getting built. It's going to involve dismantling the ways that the mission model has attempted to enclose the Native California experience historically. You can see that enclosure at work, the mission model's enclosure of the Native California historical experience, in some of the defenses. Now, there were a couple defenses voiced in, defenses of the project, that is, voiced in some of the coverage that I found. Real tepid, hesitant, apologetic almost defenses of the mission project, usually ending up in what I think are kind of misguided attempts to bring balance of perspectives to the past. I think people think you're being fair-minded if you say, we're going to balance this perspective with this perspective, rather than weighing actual perspective, which perspective is actually closer to the truth. It ends up like this in the LA Daily News, kind of attributing an opinion to a proponent of the mission project. The LA Daily News' encapsulation was, quote, "Abuse and disease were part of the picture, but so were the Spanish and Mediterranean architecture, food, and culture that are part of California today." So, right, both perspectives. 100 years ago, that sentence would have looked pretty similar. The first part would have been phrased differently, probably. They wouldn't have said disease and abuse, although even 100 years ago, people recognized that the missions were hard on the Native people of California. That second part would have been basically the same. There's a deep current in California that holds that our history as Californians begins with the missions, begins with, quote, Spanish and Mediterranean influences. California Indian history ended there. So it ended there to be picked up by Spanish history. The tells in that sentence, I think, are Spanish and Mediterranean. These are the favored euphemisms in the early 20th century when promoters are trying to market Southern California to Midwestern tourists, saying it's like you can go to Europe for cheap. It's like Spain, it's like Italy, it's like Greece. Marketing California as safely exotic to tourists, downplaying the growing number of working class, more recently immigrated Mexican Southern Californians. That is not at all what the tourist promoters wanted to emphasize in Southern California, so they say Spanish, Mediterranean. When did our Spanish and Mediterranean heritage begin? It began with the missions. There's also some competition with Northern California built into this. Northern California claims the gold rush. San Francisco and Sacramento claim the gold rush. Southern California needs something to hang its hat on, something better, they say. The gold rush is driven by greed, by libido, by cutthroat competition. Southern California history begins with paternal caretakers, right? Very nice, pre-modern, pre-industrial, gentle, tranquil, garden-like setting. So in this version of history, which becomes kind of the statewide model of the version of California history, the missions are the vanguard of European civilization, taming, civilizing, cultivating, any of those kind of related verbs you want to use. So Anglo-Californians can claim this as part of their history, and this is where history begins. Dr. Lorimer is going to tell that story better than I'll be able to do, but I want to make the point here about the missions as a model for containing Indian history, that it persists even when it's pretty clear that the actual experience of Native Californians overflows that container. So that mission, just a little bit more on that mission kind of mythology as a model for framing California Indian experience. There's this thing at the beginning of the 20th century called the mission play, a dramatization of the history of the missions, again, created to entice tourists. The owner of the Mission Inn in Mission San Gabriel wanted tourists to come, say, well, I'm going to stage a play, a pageant. People will come and watch it. They'll tell their friends. More people will come. It's incredibly popular. One literature professor writes, after seeing that, you can see the entire history of California in an evening just watching the mission play. It tells the story in 3 acts of the arrival of the Franciscans in California, the establishment of the missions, and at the end of the play, the missions are falling apart. The American invasion is looming. So it's kind of marketing that story in a dramatic way. Giant stage, cast of hundreds, or at least a cast of 800, and it becomes really, really popular. You got to go see the mission play if you come out to California in the 1920s. Interestingly, so the LA Chamber of Commerce buys all the properties, buys the rights to the play, and they stage it on in a giant playhouse. They hire Mexican and California Indian, Mission Indian people as extras and to work in the gift shop when the play is being staged, and to add kind of that flavor of authenticity. And it works. One writer at the time says of the non-Anglo actors in the play, they, quote, live their parts. It's real to them. It's make-believe for us, but it's like this is what they were born to do, play Mission Indians. Another writer says, in the presence of people with flashing dark eyes, black hair, and olive skins, we almost forget that we're living in 1927, right? So the future is going to be white. The past is, quote, olive skin, right? There's that disjuncture. Native history ends. Anglo history, white history, European history is going to continue on. Bring it back to that LA Daily News article just about a month ago. The lasting legacy of the missions is its Spanish and Mediterranean architecture, its food, its culture, kind of a real tricky sleight of hand, somehow trying to link Spanish colonization to the more recent history of cultural and racial diversity in California and more recent immigrants from Mexico and Central America. In any case, what lasts in California history just cannot be Indian. It's going to be European. The missions are at the end of the road. Going back into the 19th century, the missions are a popular idea, a metaphor, a model for how people think about the Indian experience in California. The idea that the best Indians could aspire to was the model that was set up by the missions. That's going to shape Indian policy in California, actually government policies for Native people. is shaped by this idea that the best thing that ever existed for Native people in California was the mission. So that's the mission model as a model for policy. This is what American policymakers use when they are answering what they call in the 19th century the Indian question. The Indian question is basically what's to be done with the Indians, or more specifically, how do you take the owners of the land and turn them into mere occupants of the land. So when California enters the U.S., the question arises, what rights, if any, do we have to respect belonging to Native people in the soil? Do they actually own it? Do we have to buy their rights to the land? There is a difference of opinion on this in 1850, 1851. And again, for reference, Americans go back to the mission model. One federal agent reports that, quote, Spanish law was, quote, tender to the rights of Indians. Yeah, it recognized Indians' rights in the land, but he elaborates. It's a principle constantly laid down in Spanish colonial laws that Indians shall have a right to as much land as they need for their inhabitations, for tillage, and the pasturage of their flocks. So as much land as they need to do things that were introduced by Europeans, not as much land as they need to practice an indigenous form of subsistence that sustained sovereign, independent Native communities, Native nations, but as much as they need to subsist themselves like the model, like the mission model. Another agent's report kind of flipped that right. He says it's not that the land belongs to the Indians, it's that Indians, quote, naturally belong to the missions. And he says any Indians living near a former, quote, Hispanic patron consider themselves appendages. Basically, they derive all of their rights through him. He went so far as to say that they consider themselves the property of Spanish rancheros. And he likewise, in estimating the value of his lands, always counts upon the services of his 50 or 100 Indians to enhance its value. So they're saying, yeah, the land they can use as long as they're tilling it and as long as they're taking care of livestock, but really they belong to a non-Indian landowner. Another report, again debating what's to be done with California Indian titles, Thomas Butler King says, no, Spain or Mexico never recognized Indian rights to land, which wasn't true. It was a popular argument, though. They can just live at the mercy of whoever takes over the state next, by which he means the Americans own it now. They can do what they want with Indian people, which is basically what happens. 18 treaties get signed with California Indians. None of them get ratified. We probably know that story. California's legislature actually lobbies the Senate to block ratification of the treaties that would have set up relatively large reservations in California. California's got a solution, better alternative. Don't set up big federal reservations in the middle of the Central Valley and the Coast Ranges in Southern California. Better solution. Again, the mission model. What we propose, the California Senate says, is a system of missions for the Indians. Again, the best thing that ever happened was the missions. They can be easily provisioned while continuing to provide labor for white landowners. The Senate says that in Southern California, if you create these treaty reservations, you're going to pull native laborers away from vineyards and ranches, which is going to be a detriment to the economy of Southern California. It will, quote, strike a blow on the agriculture of the South. Leave them where they are, under the, quote, paternal protection of the old residents of the country. Those who now resided on, quote, private lands are already in the best school of civilization. They're perfect. The heirs to the missions are just private citizens setting up a farm or ranch, saying you guys can live on my land, native Californians, if you provide your labor. That will increase the value of my property. That will not benefit you. The treaties fail. The federal government is left in sort of a bind. It has to put together an Indian policy for political reasons, for ideological reasons. So it improvises a reservation system, a military reservation system withdraws land. The Secretary of the Interior says we should withdraw this land, set it up for basically landless Indians in California who aren't employed by private citizens, set up some reservations. They probably won't last very long. Again, what is the model for these reservations? The, quote, stately missions, California's Superintendent of Indian Affairs says, where every useful mechanical art, all necessary knowledge of agricultural pursuits are taught under a system of discipline at once mild, firm, and paternal. So at every new starting point in the history of non-Indians dealings with Indians, you're going to go back to the mission model. Say, we're going to do this. Indians are going to stop doing Indian things. We're going to move on to the next phase of history. The first reservations in California are explicitly modeled on mission ranches and then the private ranchos that take over the mission lands. The first reservation under the system is built on top of a private rancho. So the idea is you're basically going to work for this guy that owns the land. That's good for you. That's teaching you something. He gets the benefit of your labor. You're in a, quote, school for civilization. Critics of the reservation system say, no. Getting the government involved at all is bad. That's contrary to the whole point of the mission system. Turn Native people over to the private citizens, to what we would call the private sector, immediately. In 1858, one government inspector said that the reservation system has done nothing to instill thrift and industry like the way the missions have. He said the mission system was great. We ought to do that. We're not doing it on the reservations. The mission fathers fed the Indians better, treated them more kindly, he says, clothed them more adequately, better saw to their moral and spiritual instruction. Again, we can do that, he says. We should do that. That's the best place for Indians in a mission, but on private land. For him, this inspector in 1858, the missions were kind of like plantations. He's a Southerner. He's a pro-slavery Southerner who comes to California. His name is Goddard Bailey. He worked in the Interior Department before he had to quit because he stole a bunch of money. Fled to the South, fled to the Southern Confederacy right at the start of the Civil War. So he's a pro-Southern sympathizer. So when he says this, he means it as a good thing. He says the mission Indians were very nearly in the condition of slaves on a plantation in the cotton-growing states. He says, right on, that was great, because plantations are great. It teaches people who are naturally subordinate to work, to improve the property values of the people who own the land. Again, back to the mission model, a new interpretation, decades after the missions are gone, but saying this is going to work well for us pro-slavery, pro-Southern policymakers and control of federal policy in the 1850s. End of the Civil War kind of ends that vision. The federal government sees in Indian policy a similar emancipatory promise, the need to use federal power to lift up Native people to citizenship, the way that African Americans in the South had risen out of slavery. This federal policymakers make a one-to-one comparison. We're going to do an Indian policy where we did in the Reconstruction South, whether or not American Indians want citizenship in the United States. We're going to give it to them through the power of the paternal power of the federal government. Again, what's the model? What could we turn to that's going to be really good for raising up Indians in California? The missions. So carefully were the rights and privileges of the Indians guarded by the Spanish government, said one superintendent of Indian Affairs in the 1870s. It's to be regretted that our own government has not seen fit to adopt a similar policy of governing Indians in California. That we could do this. This time we could do it for sure. We could create a mission system in California. And specifically, in a state where most reservations are overrun by white trespassers. There's a couple Indian reservations by the 1870s, most of them occupied by white ranchers to the detriment of Indians, which is kind of a problem for federal credibility. This agent says, Indian affairs, if they're in the hands of missions, will be free from the petty cabals and caste prejudices of local tribunals, basically saying get local people, get the state of California out of it, put the federal government back in charge. This time, for sure, we mean it. It's going to work better. The missions are going to be that model for lifting Indians into the mainstream of history. The models of the mission, the reservation system, still suffers from trespassing. Most Native people in California continue to live and work off of the reservation, not under some kind of imagined tutelage system, but under wage labor conditions. They're working for pay. Late 19th century and early 20th century, the missions come back as a model again for government policy, largely through the writing of Helen Hunt Jackson and a guy named Charles Fletcher Loomis. Loomis is notable because he's one of the founders of the Landmarks Club, which is responsible for restoring the missions in Southern California. Again, boosting Southern California as a tourism destination. Hey, we got these great tourist attractions. We fix up the missions, plaster them, paint them. You got something that people are going to want to see. And for reasons I can't completely understand, it was really, really popular. If you came out to California, you want to go on and see the missions, drive up Camino Real. Helen Hunt Jackson famously wrote the novel Ramona. Before that, she wrote a series of articles, investigative reporting, journalism. She comes from an Indian policy reform background in the East. She brings that to California. She becomes enamored with the missions, the romance of old California, but also is an advocate for the rights of the people who built the missions, who lived in the missions. And her solution and Loomis's solution is the people who had worked in the missions, who had helped create this cultural legacy in California, deserve some attention from the government. The government should buy land for the Indians of California. So first, for the mission Indian communities in Southern California, the government buys some land. Again, it's very easy for government officials to say we're buying land for mission Indians. This land is going to be kind of like what they did. They're going to work on it. They're going to learn the necessary lessons of civilization. That program gets broadcast to the rest of the state in the early 20th century. The federal government, under pressure from these Indian rights groups, purchases more than 80 different parcels of land and puts it into trust for California Indian communities, which is the origin of the present day, not the immediate origin, it goes back further than this, but the trust land, the tribal trust lands that exist in the rancherias, comes out of this federal program to buy land for the landless Indians of California. The government agent in charge of buying that land doesn't explicitly relate them to missions, but he's coming out of this reform tradition where the missions are the best thing for Indians that ever existed. He says it's not necessary that the Indians be made rich in California. Just buy them a little bit of land. What are they going to do with the land? They cannot farm it. It's 10 acres of land. You're not going to compete in early 20th century agriculture in California with this land. You're going to work for pay for somebody else. You're going to work for a white landowner. This is explicitly the argument. You're going to continue to work for wages that are going to sustain you. And the punchline at the end, mere footholds with fixity of tenure. Again, they don't own it. They have tenure rights to it, meaning they have rights to it of occupancy bestowed by somebody else, where they can, quote, learn everyday lessons that they need so much. So again, land tenure is a form of instruction and civilization, going back to the mission model. But a funny thing happened in the 20th century. Something unexpected happens out of all of these little parcels of land modeled on the missions. These continuous returns to the mission model reproduces Indian reservations and reservations as the home of sovereign Indian tribes. And in 21st century California, the state can't ignore the fact that there are Indian tribes in the state. The public may be vaguely aware of the fact that California has more acknowledged Indian tribes than any other state in the lower 48. The highest Indian population of any state in the United States. It's not easy to tell a story that assumes Native people are locked in the past when they are clearly part of the modern life of the state. So clearly part of the modern life of the state that they can exert some political leverage in something like what I started my talk with, the end of this mission project. The story has changed through the intervention of Native people and allies. We're not likely to see the missions as places of as the mission playwright said, happy days of prayer and peace and laughter. We're more likely to see the missions as sites of disease and abuse. But if we just stay in the mission model, we can't explain what I just described, that early 21st century presence of so many distinct sovereign Indian nations, and just as many others waiting for federal recognition. So you have a tribal state in a state that has denied that Indians have any presence past this mission model. Go back to the mission model, and you can start to see your way out of this story, I think. Even within the history of the missions, we have a way to begin to tell the story that doesn't make, quote, Spanish or Mediterranean architecture the boundary walls of Indian experience. Start with the fact in the missions that Spanish ambition never matched their power. There is a native country beyond the walls of the mission that draws out runaways, draws out the people the Spanish called apostates, people that rejected Christianity, draws in indigenous raiders, like constantly. So there is a world beyond the missions always. Within the missions, New societies formed, new societies that the Spanish had not imagined and would be pretty dismayed to foresee. You read the Spanish records, there is constant complaining by the missionaries that the Indians are superficial converts to Catholicism. They will complain of persistent indigenous healing practices, persistent indigenous religious practices, persistent dances, and in fact, by the early 1800s, they have to give up trying to stop those things. Again, something to keep in mind, they're always outnumbered by Native people in the missions. Those populations are composed of many different people. Marriage patterns change to incorporate newcomers, people, more distant people, I should say, people who are new to you, people who might have been strangers. Intermarriage with the Spanish was relatively rare in the missions, but intermarriage across older indigenous national boundaries was pretty common in the missions. So you're creating new families, new kinship groups, new tribal identities. There's an emergent mission Indian identity, and a lot of tribes today carry that in their name. Bands of mission Indians. People start blending cultures. You get distinctive kinds of ceramics produced in the missions, just to name one example. So new kinds of culture, new kinds of identity. And what about the Spanish and Mediterranean architecture? Indians built that. They are the ones doing the labor, all of the labor in the missions. The labor sustained the missions. Sometimes their labor, undermined the missions. Sometimes their concerted efforts destroyed the missions. But the mission communities are founded on native presence, native labor, native work to build community. And this is why they're still there working in the gift shop in the mission play in the 1920s, because they are undertaking a work of community, rebuilding community. So within the mission, within all of the different iterations, the versions of the mission model that come in the 19th century and early 20th century, there are Native people doing Native things that push against those walls. And I think this is what I hope most doesn't get abandoned as we abandon the mission model. Seeing these as Indian places, seeing Indian communities, missions as Indian places, as all of the later versions, the reservations, the rancherias as Indian places, even places on private land where Indians work but claimed no title to, those become Indian places. Places where people did the hard work of rebuilding community under adverse circumstances. So this is one of the hardest things I think about, teaching this history, studying this history, just thinking about this history, how to tell it not just as a record of things done to Indians, imposed on them, a model imposed on them from above. I want to think about that because I want to avoid getting trapped in another version of this mission model, replicating unintentionally the idea that the mission was the end of the road for California Indian history. It's a trap even for people who, like myself, who want to insist that history kept going after the missions. We're somewhat trapped by this story because we want to push back against that romance. That romantic image is so ingrained in California culture that the missions were happy places where people labored happily and peacefully. That we want to remind people, no, this was not great for the Native people who lived there. This was done. This is part of an invasion, I think, is the larger thing to remember. This wasn't just a couple people saying, hey, your religion's wrong, do something different. This was an invasion that denied that Indian people owned their own countries. So we want to push back against that. Say these are places of death, these are places of despair, these are places of loss. But communities persisted out of this. If we're lucky, we get the first part heard, places of death, places of despair. It seems to be a part that's getting heard in the state today. The next part of the story about Indian history gets kind of lost, or it's subsumed again but the history of California is the Spanish Mediterranean and Anglo history of California. I'm sure Indians were there, but they weren't part of it. If we don't keep telling that story, we don't get to the parts that explain why they're identifiable communities of mission Indians today, why California has more tribes than any other state. It's impossible to understand Native California, the history of Native California, without trying harder to understand the labor that Indian communities undertook to rebuild themselves within that model, to push out against that model. That experience of labor, that experience of work, I think is a good through line for all of this. It's a defining feature of the Native communities that existed before the invasion. Native communities labored in an abundant environment in California to build densely populated and complicated, complex societies in the places that came to be called Alta California. Their labor continued in the missions. The labor continued for people who were not part of the missions, for people who were in the missions into the 20th century. That work of community broke out against the mission model. Last thing I want to say about the missions. I was just kind of looking at some of them online because I actually didn't. I went to school in California in the 4th grade. I didn't build a mission. My teacher took me to the California Indian Museum instead, which in retrospect I was grateful for. But I never had that experience of actually building the mission model, which I never understood to be common, but is pretty common. I was looking at some of them online, and the thing that strikes me the most is none of those mission models have any people in them. Like I know you can buy the little figures. Kind of the kind of 1930s Western-looking Indians dressed up, and put them in there by the fathers. But most of the mission models, as they're presented, don't have any of the people. So the focus really is on the buildings, and that's always struck me as an odd way to teach history, which is about human stories. Put the people back in is I think what we have to do with the mission story. The people who are always the majority in the missions. Who did the work, who made the missions part of their history, their ongoing, longer history, to tell that story that goes out beyond the mission walls and encompasses much more than just the adobe of the buildings. So, thank you. Oh, and questions? Or we should go on to the next. Okay. Thank you. To work my way for something better. It doesn't exist yet, but hopefully soon. So my next task is to thank you once again and to welcome Michelle Lorimer. Dr. Lorimer teaches in the history department at Cal State San Bernardino. She holds a PhD in history from UC Riverside, where she specialized in California Indian history and public history. She's a co-author of Silencing California Indian Genocide and Social Studies Texts, and her book, Resurrecting the Past, The California Mission Myth, was just published last year. It tells the story of how California's Franciscan missions made the unlikely journey from frontier outposts relying on coerced indigenous labor in the late 18th century to tourist attractions in the early 20th, paying close attention to the actual experience of Indian people in the missions. Indian Country Today reviewed it very positively, declaring it should be required reading for anyone connected to the public history of the missions. It belongs on a shelf along with the best books written on the missions. So it is my pleasure to join you in welcoming Michelle Lorimer.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I just need to get my PowerPoint started. While that gets going, I think that Khal made many excellent points in talking about the influence that the missions have had over the last 200 years. If we look at the ways that history has been reconstructed to be something different than the real lived experiences of the people who were impacted by missions over decades, over generations, and that have continually impacted Native ways of living into today. I mean, the missions are significant in influencing the historical development of California, but what we see and what Khal expressed very well is that the missions have been often very glorified as a part of California history, and that glorification continues in a lot of the projects that we see for students, and that glorification just continues in popular culture in general. As Khal was talking about the mission project, and Stacey and I mentioned quickly, I never did the mission project in 4th grade. We went to Knott's Berry Farm. I'm from Southern California, so that's our theme park that has some gold rush stuff. So I think we panned for gold for like half an hour, and then we got to do roller coasters after. But now that this theme park has mission replicas in their California history section, and they have a man who's restoring the replicas, working on them as you walk through. And it's an intense labor of love for this man. This work is tedious, what he's doing. These are replicas that I think are from the 20s, and they're gorgeous structures, but they're void of people and of human presence, and they're replicas of modern mission images. They aren't missions as they were with people in them. They have still the elaborate gardens in the front. As you see, if you go to missions today, they have the gardens in the quadrangle inside. And those aren't the ways that missions were for when they were working missions with people living in and around them. The gardens that we see around mission sites today are there as a way to romanticize these sites and the images that we see about them. So what I'm working on, and I'm lucky enough to have my mother-in-law is a professor of teacher education at Cal Lutheran University. So her and I have partnered together to build a structure for a unit design interface, I guess. I'm a historian, so to me I want to use the word framework, but I know that it's not correct at all to use that word. But what I mean is that we're building a way to deliver new curriculum that would cover California history, and that would be easily accessible to teachers and to students, that is engaging and relevant and explores historical experiences in various ways and includes primary sources and secondary sources. And it's really heavily influenced by the voices that we have in this room, and by trying to provide an alternative perspective of the mission, and actually not mission history at all, of California history that is grounded in the environment and in Native perspectives, Native history, and that sets the stage there. And from that point, we will move forward into newcomers in the region, but that the focus is in the environment, in Native history, in, as Gregg was saying yesterday as we talked, the bulk of what's happening in California history, the long history, and then we would get into the newcomers arriving in the short term. So Khal referenced this, and so I will just go over it very quickly, and Stacey talked about it a little bit as well. But this is looking at some of the current pedagogical practices. My mother-in-law, Maureen, whose name was on the first slide, couldn't be here, so I'm presenting the educational side for her, but I'm a historian, so bear with me. When we look at the ways that California history is presented commonly today, we see that a lot of it focuses on European and American contact, beginning histories at that segment. How many of you teach 4th grade? Okay. And what projects do you use? I don't want to put you on the spot. Yeah.
We do our best to learn songs and dances that were in the mission, and the idea of written music is that European influence and how they were juxtaposed to what the native people had as instruments. I teach in an art school.
Okay.
And we look at the ceramics and the way they were designed, and the design of tiles based on both the artwork that happened in the missions and what the natives brought.
So you're merging cultures by looking,
We're trying to look at those cultures and how they emerged as different cultures.
So yeah, you're looking at the intersection there that's happening at the missions through visual and performing arts. Right. Okay, so that's part of what we want to include here. Does anybody else want to share what they do? Yeah. Okay, so guest speakers is another option. Yeah.
I don't have any nearby missions,
Yeah, that was one of my concerns when I was coming here, is that we're more inland. There wasn't a Sacramento mission. The closest missions we have would probably be San Francisco, Sonoma, San Rafael's, that's a little further north, I think, San Jose, Santa Clara. So there's not a mission here, and so I would imagine that a lot of the colonial history that we're looking at in this region may be more American gold rush history. But we can still look at this big structure, so that most of the current pedagogical practices look at California through the lens of newcomers, of not native perspectives generally. So we're looking at what happened when the Spanish came in. Yes, there were native people here, but native people came into the missions and were brought into this new Spanish culture and way of living, and it's treated in a more benign fashion that continues to glorify the missions and their structures, but not so much what's happening with native people. It's not exploring that side of the experience. A lot of this curriculum also is based in textbooks that offer limited perspectives, that don't have multiple voices. We can't see or touch or hear alternative perspectives and compare those things. So we're looking at ways to try to move away from superficial examinations of this history. So some of these projects include, like we talked about, creating missions and dioramas that you can buy from Michael's, a diorama set, or off of Amazon, and put it together on your kitchen table. People make some out of sugar cubes there in the bottom corner. My neighbor's son is currently doing this mission project, and she's going to make it out of, I think, Rice Krispie treats. Despite my sources that I sent her. As a true academic, here's the list of sources that you can reference, and I'll help your son. Here's a Rice Krispie treat mission. I don't know if that's really what she's finally decided, but what that's showing is that this is a living project, that it's not something that's in the past. It's not something that stopped in the 90s or in the 60s even. This is something that's continuing on. And what we're looking at is trying to create something that will be engaging and complex and pull in many people's voices and experiences, and something that teachers can use fairly easily. So what we want to do is have something that is cross-curricular. Because when we look at this history, it really, that's what it is. It's not one thing. So our preliminary title is Looking Along Trade Trails. So we're grounding it in the land. Yes?
Article, there was a whole magazine that was dedicated that would be helpful, I think, for everyone. But for volume 28, number 2, it was for 2014-2015 full magazine.
Yeah, Gregg brought that, right? Is that, it's up here.
Oh, my daughter is right now. We highlighted a lot of those stories in there for her to be the actor. And that's
Yes.
I'm probably off base, but because my husband is Ohlone and African American, and I'm also talked out, but I come at it with a different perspective because I live in the school and I advocate for students. I come from a very different and but I work with 6 pretty homicides in Lake County. And one of the challenges with the schools, I'm hearing from the schools that the parents are not as engaged as they would like them to be. I have to point out that when you have a project that's estimated and it is glorified, it makes it very difficult for them to feel welcome or to feel a part of the school system, especially when they're seeing their friends and seeing these projects glorified in such a way. I often have a very hard time because I teach my children correctly at home the truth through story and by them talking to their elders. My husband's uncle plays in Berta-Avila, and we're really trying to teach the kids right now about the city. So when these projects are going on, and I'm listening, and I don't mean to be offensive, but I almost feel offended because I have to go back and I have to explain to my children who I'm trying to teach them to be respectful to people at school, their teachers, and to go into this environment, and yet this is what we're met with year after year, and then everybody still seems to be trying to kind of sanitize it, and it's not a way to sanitize it. So I don't mean to be offended. I'm just trying to, I guess I'm just trying to keep my opinion as a parent, and also as an advocate, but also as an educator, because I have my students that come back and they ask me, well, why do I have to do this then? Why is it still being done? And I guess I'm confused because I don't really have the answer to it.
Yeah, I think that's what we are trying to turn away from with. Yeah.
I just want to add my personal experience. My mom's a Apache Navajo, obviously didn't stand earlier. But I told her I was coming to this, and she's very, very anti this white Caucasian, very much racist on that side. And so I told her I was coming here, and she's like, what, they're finally going to teach the truth? And I feel like that's part of the history, but also we want to acknowledge people that went through the mission system and maybe some of the ones that were able to, I wouldn't say successfully, but that's a part of their history and descent as well. So I used to work at the mission in Sonoma, and you get people that are either diehard Catholic or, wouldn't even want to step foot inside. And I think both of those voices need to have a place, need to be acknowledged as well. So you and I, and my mom especially, can be very, very anti, whitewashing of the history, and I do feel, and I think there needs to be like kind of like a middle ground almost where all sides can contribute, and that's what I'm here for, is trying to figure out where that is, and where educators are trying to find that middle ground, so I can give them the best program possible.
Yeah, and I think that Stacey and I were talking about this, and when we look at the way that the framework is constructed and really being inquiry-based, that's where we can really push for students to do a lot of that thinking. So we provide resources, and then students can come to conclusions and use inquiry to find out those answers. So what I will show you is an avenue to provide that inquiry for students. So that's what we're trying to create, is something that would facilitate inquiry-based learning and exploration, show primary sources, so that we're not saying that do not teach the missions, that mission history didn't exist and don't talk about it, but that let's look at the complexities of this period, and let's not pretend that it was a very romantic and easy time for people who lived through it. It was quite difficult, and we need to address the realities of people's experiences and their continued and recognize current voices that can illustrate that. Yes?
Just briefly, Dr. Coughlin comments earlier about the need for professional development is implicit in all this as well, because to introduce something as complex as this takes a lot of time, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and trial and error and all that. It's a huge population is trying to do this, trying to do the thing. I think that's a real significant part of this discussion.
Yeah, and we've been talking about the ways that this would be implemented and how people have been working for decades to try to do this. And we feel like right now we're at a very good point where we can use the internet and use digital resources to provide a platform that can serve people fairly easily and have it be very user-friendly and interactive, so that it's not going to take a lot of training to explore the resources that are available, so that we can go in and share this stuff, but that it also can be adopted fairly easily. Yes?
As a K-12 teacher and a college professor with director of the Integrated Studies program, mother, grandparent, I'm going to say something that probably will offend some people, but my middle grandson, I went to his 4th grade teacher and asked what they were going to do, and said that if he had to build a mission, that it wasn't going to be any better than having a Jewish kid build a model of Auschwitz. And then I, for some reason, it resonated with me that the new framework says, well, we're just going to study the daily activities of the mission. Well, that's the same thing as sitting a bunch of Jewish kids down and having them study the daily activities at Auschwitz. I don't see a big difference. Luckily, we moved and you didn't have to do that.
I think we can get at a lot of the complexities of and a lot of the hardships of and the negative aspects of mission life. If we're looking at some, for instance, if we look at, it would be really dry, and you wouldn't want to do it like that. But if you look at the population data for the population data for missions, and for some had really good records. So if you look at births and deaths at the mission, that could get students to see the very high death rate. And so you could provide some sources like that and then pair it with testimony to get at if you're looking at daily life, death was a part of daily life for many people. So yeah, while it's a very difficult thing, you have that aspect. That's just me thinking out loud.
I think that, for me, the point is, it is a part of the history, so it's not like we can't teach it. But one of the things, and it's great to have a peer student advocate as well, because that's not the only history. And I think that's what's been missing, that's where people are going to go. So if you were a Jewish kid and you didn't teach about Auschwitz, that would be a major loss, because that is a major part of what shaped that community. We have to teach about this, about what went on, and the current debate is how we do it. Exactly, and that's, I think, where the curriculum's going is what's in the community now. That's where we're going to tie it in. Where do we get these resources to pair up with people who, like for me, live in Monterey that are still apart, especially if they aren't super well organized there. The missions did crush a lot of coastal communities.
Yeah, we can still turn to people that have knowledge. Yeah.
So, as a teacher that wants to respect all the groups, groups that have been traumatized tend to protect the culture and keep it personally in their hearts and not share it. And I've been taught that unless I was given a Native American song by a Native American, I shouldn't sing it. And unless I was taught to dance, I shouldn't do it. And so if you're not putting your culture out there, it's really hard to do what you're doing. I want to be respectful, but I also want my students to know about the culture and to honor it, even if it's not their fault. So I feel like we have to find a way to put it out there and be great and share it if we're going to heal it.
Well, I don't think there is any one size fits all. That's part of the dilemma here. But I think just opening this up even here today is something that is almost heart-wrenching, and your mind is trying to wrap around it when you really start hearing what really happened at these missions, considering what we have been teaching in our schools and in the publicity that we have around the missions, right? It's all this really, really good stuff, but the reality is that some really horrific things happen there. So it's about how and why it's so important is so that we understand that historical relationship and how that impacts a group of people, right? It's not just a history lesson for us as tribal people. It's about how this practice, how this belief has been carried on by this society for so long, ignoring the real consequences. And now we have to begin to understand the consequences of ignoring that type of historical event and how that fails to help our whole society understand that those kinds of behavior and carrying that story in that wrong way impacts a group of people. Again, not just for 1 year, 2 years, but decades. And we still are part of that if you can't change that experience for these young people. And that's the job you have, is changing that. So there's not one answer, and I think that's why the point we're at is it has to draw in that human contact, that communications at a different level than what we've had before. And so it's going to bring other things out for you and the people too in your communities. The first time they're going to sit at a table to be heard and to be translated into something that may reflect their true intent. So that's a real difficult job for anybody, and that's what our job has been for years and years and years, is to help communities understand how to interact with tribal communities, because the historical practice of this government and of the people of this government has been to socially isolate this group of people, to geographically isolate this group of people. Mm-hmm. And so here now you guys are in an endeavor to bring those pathways closer together so that we can say to this group of people, we are no longer going to tell the story this way. We are ready to tell the story the good way. So it's not going to be easy in any of this. So I know my experience has been going back to table at time after time where the story hasn't changed year after year, but you have to keep going back because you know what that final destination has to be. And that's what we're getting here today, is the idea of what that final story might look like. And it may not be comfortable for any of us, but it has to, and the lessons you learn along the way are going to help you become better prepared to help that student understand what had happened in this country. And if we don't give voice to it, then the same type of mentality is going to continue, and we'll never hear the full story of what happened to the first people of this continent. My family is traced back 14,000 years in Lake County. Has anybody heard that? But if you hear that, doesn't that give you a whole different perspective about where we come from as people? To be able to say my family can be traced back 14,000 years in a particular area. So we need to share that with these young people coming, that there is this group of people within our community that has a whole different type of story to tell than you've ever heard before. And we can be the messengers that deliver that message. So it's not going to be easy, but it can be done, and this is what this effort has been about. And I just can't tell you how excited I am about it. Me too, I'm sorry.
I think Connie said something really important earlier, that idea of how we need to be dealing with it. you're sort of at the ground floor of this effort, even though in some ways it's been going on for a couple of decades now, trying to reform the curriculum. But as community, we're just dealing with a skill, and we know that need of people now wanting to know about us. But we're still dealing with the issue of how to do that, and whether we even want to do that, for all those historical reasons. And I should tell you that it won't surprise you. It's controversial within our own community. I get a lot of feedback, both positive and negative. Why am I doing this? Why are people participating? Why are you telling this story? They misunderstand because we probably haven't communicated well enough with our tribal communities what our intent is. We are not part of the intent to glorify any of the colonization. We're not, in my view, and many people agree with me in the tribal community, not going to wipe it out either. Because as somebody mentioned earlier, from my perspective, that San Antonio mission was built not by the Spaniards, but by my ancestors in their very blood and sweat, is in the walls of that church. I don't want to ignore that part, but how do we tell that? Because for us, it is personal. For many others, even the most well-meaning of allies, it is a passionate pursuit of history as a hobby, as a profession. And for us, it's our life. It's our very existence. And it lives with us now. If we don't have a perception of time, we don't view history. That's actually a foreign concept to us. That history is us now, and it's part of us now. And so we have to work how we're going to integrate that concept with this foreign concept of history, taking it apart, looking at it, and sharing our very heart and our sorrow in that context. And that's a big part of the problem.
I would invite you to know that probably many of the people that you're sharing with also, my family ran from slavery and slavery, right? So you're Irish. So.
And I find that that's part of the process is relating it to people's own history. We always talk about people, but everybody's indigenous from somewhere, and they have that history to tell. So in telling our story, perhaps you can better relate by relating it to your own ethnicity, your own genealogy, your own culture that came from somewhere else.
Thank you. Thank you. Get my mind back around this. So then in trying to develop something that is in line with the framework and that is inclusive of many voices, we're proposing this structure that would provide many different perspectives into historical events, into the past, and through many different lenses. So looking at things through geography, through visual and performing arts, through literature, and through history. So we're encompassing many different aspects of curriculum into this, and that really examine the complexity of history, as you can obviously hear in this room. And that connect things that are broader themes that we see that Khal mentioned. So we have the missions as this initial form of settlement from the Spanish in California, but then that same format is used over and over and over and applied towards Native people, and without their agency considered or voices. And so let's address that in the broader historical context of things that we look at. So another part of the framework is incorporating things like timelines, maps, primary source artifacts. So within that, we plan to have oral histories within this that explain different things. Also literature and curriculum that's been developed on local levels that we'll talk about later. And then we've created an enduring understanding and essential questions to get us through this. So Students understand that relationship between the natural environment, Native people, and newcomers in California is multifaceted and complex. And in writing this, of course, this is open to adjustments. We wrote that emphasizing the 1700s and 1800s in there because that's a period of significant impact from newcomers on Native groups. So to see what happened during that period, but to not have the focus be only there, that it is a continuum that we're looking at here. And then these are the series of essential questions that we have to get us there. So how did the natural environment influence the diverse development of Native Californians' languages, cultures, beliefs, and lifestyles? These questions are very, very basic, and they are alluding to a much more complex history. But it is a very basic question that just opens the doors for a lot of investigation for students. And part of this is not looking at Native California people as some whole conglomerate group, but really focusing specifically on your area, because there isn't a California Indian. It's a misnomer. It's not correct. So to look at particular regions and actually focus on the groups of that area. How did people's lives change over time following the arrival of newcomers? So it's looking at the shifts that happened in there. So within that then would be examinations of people's lives before newcomers arrived. That's a significant part of this. Considering the events between 1769, that's the beginning of the Spanish mission system, and 1850, so the creation of California as a state. What do the perspectives of Native people and newcomers reveal about these relationships? So it's looking at those multiple perspectives during that period and understanding the complexity of the relationships there. So a lot of this will be inquiry-based. And how have Native people in California adapted and survived through centuries of change? So always coming back to Native people and their current experiences and looking at this as a long that Native people didn't disappear with colonization, which is, I feel like, how in most curriculum we see that, as Khal mentioned also, that we talk about Native people in the period before colonization, and then there just seems to be a disconnect from that point forward. So we want to continue looking at it as a continuum, that there are obviously still Native people today, and these cultures still continue. People are revitalizing languages where some had stopped being practices. So it's very complex. So how do we bring this complexity into the classroom? So these aren't our maps. These maps are from the California Geographic Alliance, which is on the last slide. But this is just to show what can be done today using these maps. And then ours we will develop things as we move. This is a first map looking at California geography. And realistically, we would start bigger because these political boundaries did not exist before California was a state. And so people who lived in the regions that are along California's current borders obviously had a lot of interaction, and their communities spanned beyond those borders. And so it would be significant to understand that. So we start with an understanding of California as a physical place, understanding the natural environment and the things that the natural environment provide and important aspects of the natural environment. So here you can see the coyote in the Mojave Desert, for example. I just was pulling out little things. So if we have this as an interactive map, a story map, students could click on many of these different regions and explore on their own the areas that are their local region, or compare cross-regionally. So you have coyote, coyotes are important throughout much of California. The California live oak provides acorns, and is also, oak are important for many Native people. I have here tule fibers that are used to make boats and baskets, homes. I'm just trying to include lots of different things that we see as important from the natural landscape. Salmon, these are just little bits. So you can see how you can pull from geography, from the natural environment, important natural things first. And then from there, they also have this map looking at trade trails. So we can see then, if you go back, a study of the natural environment to see the ways that landforms created different regions throughout California, and then the ways that there are things in the natural environment in those regions, but then how the natural environment also provides a structure for the way that people flow in and around the state. And so this is all before Europeans or Americans come in here. And so we're setting the groundwork in the land and in the people. What are people doing here? What are they trading? In our final version of this product, we imagine that we would have narratives and videos and objects for people to view. So this is just very early stages of this. Just 1 second. And then we can see how that trade goes further, much beyond California. We're not bound by by the political borders of our state today. And you can see how that trade extends into the Southwest, all the way essentially west of the Mississippi. There are large, complex, diverse, and highly developed cultures, languages, religions, trade, political structures, economies. We're trying to really demonstrate that through this. And so there will be additional resources to show that. And then so we're grounded there in this curriculum. And then we see Europeans and Americans come in. And if you can compare these trade trails, we see that a lot of the trails are similar that Europeans and Americans use. So if we're layering these maps, if there is a layering component in this digital interface, then you would be able to see that the ways that Americans and Europeans came into California was not new. These were very old trails that they were using. And so you can see the interplay then between newcomers, where history had traditionally started and people had traditionally learned beginning at this point. Now we have a much larger understanding of this region that then brings in these newcomers at a later stage. And we see that there's so much more complexity there. So this is Americans and Europeans as they traveled around through California. And the previous map didn't have too much ocean stuff, but you could also have a lot of native interaction along the coast. So it shows a lot of sophistication, which is something that is missing in a lot of curriculum that focuses on the missions, that Native people ended there. Instead, we're looking at a Native world that newcomers enter, a sophisticated world that new people are coming into and forcing change on. So these are just some of the ways that we're looking at that students could inquire into this. So they could examine how geography, nature, and people are interacting here. We would provide some units that would explore those different avenues. People could hear directly from Native people across time, so we can have testimonies from the 1700s and 1800s, people today talking about different parts of history and their culture, and then using maps and primary sources as a way to facilitate a lot of this. So I know I'm reaching my time limit. One of the difficulties in dealing with California history is that there is great regional diversity. And when we're looking at Native groups, the local diversity is also very prominent. You can see it. And when you learn about the history, it's evident there too. So this will have a regional focus, but then the curriculum that we'll hear about soon will be brought into the local aspects of this. So we will create this statewide structure that people can use statewide with general regions cut out, but then we can hopefully bring in local already produced curriculum that tribal groups have created that we can link for you, and that's already been created. So we really want to promote deep thinking, inquiry, understanding complex historical interactions, and all of this will align with the Common Core standards, reading, writing, listening, speaking, viewing, and making sure that a lot of this is evidence-based, so primary sources and secondary sources, but especially all types of primary source artifacts would be included in this. So these are links to the California Geographic Alliance. It's through San Diego State. But I think we're running out of time, so I'm not going to run through it. You can just Google it, and it will pop up. They have an entire lesson plan that's based on geography. These are the maps that pertain to us, but it goes much deeper into California geography. And then here's my contact information. I'm Michelle Lorimer. My mother-in-law, who is on the education side, is Maureen Lorimer. She's at Cal Lutheran. So if you would like to contact any of us about this, here's our contact information. Did you still have your question? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I had to rush through it then, but I think it.
That's all I have. If anybody has any questions. So essentially what Dr. Wilmer had is a statewide approach.
As soon as this gets put together, then we'll be able to send it out to folk, and we'll have it on the website that we're going to review now with everybody, because we do have a number of tribal communities who have said this is what we want shared. So we're going to take some time to go through that. Myself as a professor, when I go to a conference, I want to walk away with something I can use in my classroom the next day. So the same with us here. So knowing that, we've got people looking at the statewide, changing the dialogue and changing what we do, but we already have tribal communities saying, hey, we've got this curriculum, please roll it out, okay? Unfortunately, we do have some people here representing the curriculum put together, so I'm going to ask them to step forward in a sec. A quick question, please?
I'd like to ask where's the Indian input into this curriculum? Because I didn't hear any Indian input into the framework. And do you have connections? Because I don't see anybody from CIA here. I don't see anybody here from the State Indian Education Department. I don't see anybody here from the Indian Resource Centers. They're funded by the state around the state. I think there's 12 or 14 of them now. No Title VII people, except maybe the Sugar King with police in Lincoln County. So, yeah. I mean, where is the Indian input?
Well, we are running this through Native people as the curriculum is developing, but we're still working on those connections with the established infrastructure. So this is still in its beginning stages.
Well, I just want to mention that those groups you mentioned are part of the information we're feeding into Rose's office so that we can begin to create the a state map with the locations of these different, like the American Indian Education Centers, the Title VII programs, the Indian Health Projects, the tribes themselves, and we're using Native American Heritage Commission's list of their recognized tribes and our membership in all the tribes, 111 tribes in the state of California, and then There's some nonprofit tribal organizations, so we're including that on the list of resources as we're developing this. So we're pulling in all we can. We would love to hear your voice, yes. Well, I think that's what we're working on right now is the overall plan and strategy for doing that, because there are a lot of resources. For instance, the California Indian Basket Weavers Association, there's different groups. You mentioned Clayton Duncan, the different things that they're doing. So we're trying to pull that together so that we can begin to identify where those resources are. So it's an ongoing process. So if you can share that with your folks, you know that Rose is a contact, the doctor is a contact, UC Davis is a contact, and also at these different universities, there's Native American student groups that are there. So that's another area we'd like to pull them in on these things too, because they go home and talk to their families about it too. So it's an involved process, I can tell you that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. And point well taken, because it is about that California Indian vetted, and we're talking about all of you here, your teachers, your educators out there already. I appreciate the fact that you're taking your day to come in and wanting to go out with resources. I want to acknowledge Dr. Stephanie Biagetti in the back here in the corner who just walked in, who is the department chair of our teacher credentials program here, and has asked specifically, I want to make sure that the students in the pipeline, working along with Dr. Coughlin and some of my other colleagues here, that they're getting the information from California Indian communities. So the curriculum that we're going to run through now, we're offering that up in the spring. And how many sections of students do you have, Dr. Biagetti?
So in the elementary right now, we have one section actually that is going through right now in our pre-semester program of 3 additional sections. So we have at least anywhere between 100 and 125, 130 students who come to our program every year. And so this is something that we're really committed to. And we appreciate you all being here and providing input and supporting all of that.
Thank you. So while I get this up and running, so it has the website in which we already have curriculum that's been given to us by the tribal communities. I've asked Gary to come in. If you could go ahead and present the material that you have related to the Chumash. And is it okay to acknowledge?
Yeah, I'm going to.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gary Robinson. I'm Choctaw, Cherokee, Scottish, and Irish. And I let people know that. So I've got all of those flowing through me. So I'm not California native. That's to say that as well. But I've been working in the field of writing, filmmaking, digital artwork, telling the stories of Native struggle and accomplishments my entire adult career, which started with the Muskogee Creek Nation tribe in the 1980s. So you can gather how old I am. And starting there, getting kind of my feet wet, working on those kinds of projects. In your packet, you have a two-sided piece of paper. One side has the book that I'm going to tell you a little bit about, Lands of Our Ancestors. And the other side is a documentary film that I just finished creating that's going to be showing at several California Indian film festivals in November, called The Historical Hoax That Created a Saint. So I'm not on the fence about any of this. I've definitely come down on the side that I think history has validated. For the last 15 years, I've lived on the Chumash Reservation. Today I'm with my girlfriend, who's also the vice chairman of the Chumash Elders Council. Lola, would you stand up for a second? So I've worked with the Chumash Culture Department as an independent writer and filmmaker, and the Chumash Elders for the last 15 years. And everything I do, I ground in the culture and the history of the community that I'm working with. And so I've done dozens of documentary films that have been everywhere from PBS to just local channels to just distribution through DVD for schools. I've written and published 14 books on Native American topics. I'm going to be set up. Okay. I'm going to be set up during lunch where they're serving lunch at an author table. So I invite you to stop by and we can talk in more detail about some of the resources. I'm a resource creator. I'm a content creator. And I've sort of dedicated my adult career on, as I say, telling the stories of the accomplishments and struggles of Native people. That's what I'm grounded in. That's what I'm passionate about. A few years ago, Native Voices Books contacted me and asked me to help them launch a new series of books, and these are Native teen novels that feature Native American teen main characters who go on adventures and get reintroduced into their own tribal cultures. I wrote 7 of these for them, and then there's other authors who are also writing for this series. It's called the Pathfinder series, Native Voices Books. After I finished writing these, I felt I was then ready to tackle something that was very specific to California history. And I researched, with the input of the Chumash Culture Department and the elders, this historical novel called Lands of Our Ancestors. And I felt that we specifically needed work that showed a perspective that a 4th grade student could relate to and see and identify with. So the lead character of this book is a 12-year-old Chumash boy named Kilik, which means sparrowhawk. And what we see in the first few chapters is what traditional life among the Chumash people might have been like, to see how personal and emotionally attached these characters are to their own lives and their world. And then we go through a series of events that introduce them when the Spaniards arrived and how that was devastated and disrupted, again, through the eyes of these children and their families. The book, you would think, oh God, that's depressing. That's just a lot of downer stuff. Well, because we wanted to create something that was hopeful, you see that he's developing his skills as a hunter and a leader and developing the skills of courage through the things that his father is teaching him, and that becomes part of the story. And then he's called upon to help lead a group of the children, the Native children that are in the mission, as they escape with the help of their parents while the mission revolt is taking place around them. So that's where we leave this group of kids. Now, I knew that I wanted this to be able to be used in a classroom setting in addition to just being read by kids. So I contacted Kathleen Chilcote-Wallace, who's Luiseño from the San Diego area, and she helped me develop the teacher's guide. She's the primary developer of this teacher's guide. So this has got chapter questions and activities and inquiry activities that would make this usable in the classroom. So we launched this about a year ago, started getting it out. In January, I got the teacher's guide out. So I'm in a push to try to get more and more schools to become aware of it. The last 2 years, I've worked with the California Conference on Indian Education. I've been presenting workshops there, Day in the Life of Mission Indians, other healing from historical trauma, and started beginning the recognition out. So this year, the San Bernardino School District has purchased enough of these books so that every 4th grade student has one of these books, and every fourth grade teacher has a teacher's guide. And so that's kind of the beginning point for me. They're not in Chumash territory, but they saw that this was like one of the newest, most valuable resources that they could use to teach mission history. And so they've adopted it for this school year for that. I'm just now finishing production. I'll have some of these at the table because I don't have enough to pass around. I've got 20 of these. The documentary, The Historical Hoax That Created a Saint, I've made a classroom version which is shorter, just called Telling the Truth About California Missions. And I'm just now in the process of finished production on that. I'm going to start making DVD copies of that could be used. I showed it at a teacher conference sponsored by San Manuel a couple of weeks ago. And we showed the full documentary to those teachers, and we talked about the book, and a lot of the teachers said they would show it as is, even though it's kind of intended for a larger, older audience. But the feedback that I've been getting from teachers about the use of the book, for example, is that their students, their fourth grade students, are relating to these characters. They understand them as children. You know, never mind the differences that culturally may be, that's children acknowledging realistic behavior of children and how they're relating to those materials. So I'm going to have my business cards down there. I've got some other books and things to show you and be happy to spend some more time. But I'd love to work with any of the other communities that are developing resources and curriculum. I come out and do presentations and workshops for teachers or to the classroom. And this is what I do, this is what I love to do, and this is what I'm going to be doing. Lola keeps asking, when am I going to retire? I don't know. But I'm just doing this as long as I can do it. So anybody have a quick question or anything before I go move on to the next person? Okay, I look forward to talking to you all later on. Thank you very much.
All these resources, they're on that website through Sac State, and it's linked to the Department of Education, where they're working with Janet Mann. So obviously, as we secure more, and it's funny, as we put this out, I'll suddenly get a call from somebody who says, oh, you know, we've got Chapter, we've got Pomo in your curriculum, like, would you be willing to share it? Because we have teachers who would like to start using it. So we had this Ohlone curriculum was great. We have the privilege of having Gregg's participation, so we'll have him address this.
Just briefly, based on some of the comments here, as the instigator of an ad hoc committee that mysteriously, magically, and gradually became a coalition, unintended perhaps, but the coalition that's putting this together. The original concept for me as a Native person, and having learned from elders who had been working on this for decades, since the 1970s, and had, self-admittedly had limited success. My perception is that one reason is because they work from the top down. They work with the education departments. They work with the organizations. And for whatever reason, and there's many complex reasons, they had little effect still. But what I was seeing with my working in Indian country in California is that some of the local communities were taking matters into their own hands and creating their own curriculum. So it started with the Native people. So the intent with this coalition is to find all of these local curriculum that came from the Native people, and or were done by allies who worked with them and met the standard. And we had sort of had this conversation when the very beginning of the framework was being updated. So it just so happens that we're at a point where this is coming together, the coalition is kind of getting started when the framework's being implemented. And so that's what we're seeing now. The intent, though, is that all of these be from Native people or with Native input. So in this case, the Ohlone curriculum, which I was one of the many consultants with in our community, was done by Dr. Beverly Ortiz, who works for East Bay Regional Park District. And she invited everyone who wanted to in the greater Ohlone community, which is pretty large in the San Francisco Bay Area, to have input if they wish. Those who did, and there were many, and you will see many of their names in the book, which is the printed copy. But I think, is it a link, I think, is on our website to the East Bay Regional Park District where you can download the PDF for free. Don't use dial-up, it's a big one. So this is the actual curriculum. And the idea is to write it in a comprehensive way that talked about the Ohlone community and this relatively recent small part of history that you call history, as in United States and California history, is a part of that, but not the sole part. And it extends till today. Dr. Ortiz was instrumental in putting together the annual Ohlone gathering, which just happened last week. It happens the first Sunday of October every year at Coyote Hills Regional Park. And it's where all the Ohlones had the opportunity to come together and to the public and show culture, do cultural demonstrations and speak and network with the community and create a greater understanding of our culture today. And certainly a lot of the ancient traditions are coming back, being reestablished, being passed on to newer generations. But we also have a contemporary life, a contemporary component to it as well. One of our most beloved elders, who I love dearly, Ruth Orta, just retired as a bus driver for the Valley Transportation Agency. In fact, she did the light rail until she was in her 70s. So that's a true Indian story there. That's the way we are. And this other part that we're talking about, that's the part of the focus of today, is part of our story, but it's just a part of the story. So we have a lot of personal remarks and quotations in the context of telling the Ohlone story. It does focus on the East Bay, so that's an important part that I also wanted to say, that when I do public presentations, which I do to agencies, in terms of consultation, one of the things I tell them, first of all, like the disclaimer, this is my personal opinion based on my presentation of my tribal community. So I can't speak for all Native or all California Natives, but I know other Native people do agree. And I tell them, the first thing is there really is no such thing as a Native American or California Indian or indigenous person, because those are concepts that were put upon us to group us together, to balk us together for convenience purposes for the newcomers. We have to use those labels sometimes, because if I said I'm Totral, you would have no clue what that meant. If I said Salinan, some people who are familiar with California communities might know what that meant. So it creates a situation what I call the bobblehead. If you ask many California people, Native people, who, are you Indian? Mm-hmm. Are you Native American? Mm-hmm. What we want to do is teach people to ask a more appropriate question in terms of our culture. Who are you? And then I will say, I am the son of Ben and Addie Castro. My father is a Totral Salinan man. My mother was a Rumsien Ohlone person. And our people are from this place. That is how we identify ourselves. And we use those other labels for convenience. Some are a little perturbed by it, others less so. One of the things that's important to remember, though, is that we see ourselves as distinct, sovereign, autonomous, unique communities with our own culture, with our own identity, with our own spiritual values. And that was the impetus for me to have these curriculums, like was already when the coalition started. This had been in its first edition. That even though not written by a Native person, she is well acquainted with the local Ohlone community for over 30 years. Knows many, if not most of nearly all the people in the community that would have information that would pertain to this curriculum. And so they had the opportunity to comment. And they spent quite a bit of time incorporating all those comments. And you can imagine, we have as much if you imagine your own family, the diversity of opinion within it, imagine a whole community and a whole region and trying to incorporate those vastly different viewpoints into something like this. So it is a very complex, intense process, but it's very important. And this is happening in other parts of the state. So the intent of the coalition is to reflect something like this, that if either native created by the community themselves, for the local community, or to have the community have substantial influence and consultation in the process. So, any questions? Thank you very much.
So you have the complete, as you look at this here, we just addressed the lands of our ancestors, the Ohlone curriculum. Also what we have here recently given to us, and we'll take a quick look. And do we have anybody from the Kumeyaay here? Or anybody from the Wintu that could represent? Okay. I'm not California Indian, I'm Purepecha, so I always have to clarify because people sometimes think I'm representing. And then we have a Miwok Indian that was put together consultation with Dr. Martinez-O'Leary. And what's beautiful about this particular curriculum there is that you could actually almost replace Miwok and use it, put any particular tribal group in there because it creates a lot of critical thinking as people analyze stereotypes and misinformation that people have learned over time. But what I want to do right now is just touch upon here with the Wintu, Kumeyaay, and then and maybe get right over here to, we just covered the land of our ancestors, but try to get to Kathleen Chakotay-Wallace, who collaborated with Gary on his book. All right, so let's get to Run for Salmon curriculum. And this is all free and accessible on this website, if it turns up. For some reason, this is having difficulty. It's waiting. Ah, there we go. This is literally hot off the press. And Ricardo Torres, who is a member of this tribal group, recently provided this information. You have a teacher's guide. And so we're talking now about, the question is, given we want to know about the regional communities, which is what, grade 3, grade 4? Grade 3. So to be able to go to, okay, this is the Wintu, we're talking about the Shasta region and so forth. We also have the Kumeyaay, which is down in San Diego. We have the Luiseño, which is also Southern California. We have Chumash, which is the Santa Barbara area. So now we have tribal communities saying, here is some curriculum. I see Mr. Johnson here, who's tribal chair of the Nisenan, who I'm waiting for his book to get published. But we have him in the opening chapter of Ethnic Studies now. So as you go through the curriculum that we have here, you're being provided with films, embedded films, and some material that you could literally just pull right up. Somebody was asking earlier about governance. You see history and laws. So I was anxious to get to this part so you could see what the communities are saying. This is what we want you to know. This is what we've put together, and we would like you to begin using this. So again, recognizing that this is being provided from the communities themselves. And everybody has that in their packet, okay? So you'll know where to be able to access this. I'm going to go back. So you have all this material right here for the Wintu. Last year at the California Indian Conference, we had Michael Miskish, who collaborated with other individuals from the tribal community, from the Kumeyaay, Stan Rodriguez, Martha Rodriguez, and it was a beautiful thing to have the director of curriculum from San Diego Unified sitting across from Michael and saying, oh, that's ready to just give to my teachers like this, you know? And it was beautiful. I love those kind of connections. So it's just here, hand it over. So you could see here. Again, somebody was asking about storytelling, the music, the games. This afternoon we have Calvin who's going to give us some games. I'm not sure for the Maidu community, but he also has some video that has stories from elders, various tribal groups that he's sharing as well. So we're going to throw all of that onto the website. So Christy Garrett, who's right over there, she's our media guru and has helped us create this website. But we did want to create a map of California interactive so you can press on a region and be able to go right to whatever that community is sharing with us. So here we have San Diego area. Okay, and you have here in the appendices, you have games, you have storytelling. You were asking what stories to share. I know with our spiritual leaders, there's certain stories I'm allowed to tell, others I'm not allowed to tell. But here is what they're saying, this is what we're willing to give you. Okay? And even a coloring book for you to use as well. Okay, so let's go to, if you ever have the opportunity to see Kathleen present, I could sit and listen to her all day. The gift basket, you can buy it through Lulu Books, and teaching through stories. Okay, and Kathleen is from the Luceño tribe. She's a credentialed teacher, and that's why we brought her on to work with Gary, because she knows. I'm in actually counselor education, if you believe that. So when I have to turn to my colleagues from the teacher ed department to learn all this teacher talk. So when Dr. Biagietti was talking about replacement units, I was like, oh, that's an interesting name, but I guess it's part of the vernacular. So Kathleen knows that language. So when she did the teacher's guide to Land of Our Ancestors, she was citing all the standards, so that you could follow and you know what you're addressing. She does the same with the gift basket and her other work that she provides as well. So here we have the Luceño, so you have access to that as well. And we did the Coney already, the Ohlone, Lands of Our Ancestors, and then we have the map provided as well. Pre-contact tribal territories. At some point, as I mentioned, we hope to have an interactive where you could click and boom, you go right to the curriculum that's being provided. And then down below, you'll see more resources being provided as well. Somebody had talked about news from Native California. We've got that right there. The link, the Maidu Museum. If people are not familiar with the Maidu, do you have anyone here from the Maidu Museum? Would you mind sharing?
Oh, yeah.
Please.
So the Maidu Museum is a major museum group of the Southern Valley people. We're on 52-acre historic site with about 4,000 years old about. We do about 500 school tours a year. We have hundreds and hundreds of kids come through and get to what teachers are wanting and also what the new community is wanting so that we can kind of guide their tours. We use a lot of the curriculum as well as storing personal experiences and knowledge from the community to impart our training our docents and giving those to our kids too.
Okay, the Storytelling Association, Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Is it up and running or?
It's sort of on hiatus at the moment, but it was created to promote the cultural expression of storytelling, not just in a fun way, as it's perceived from the outside. It's our own educational system within tribal communities, and storytelling tells us who we are, what we should be about, how we should conduct ourselves in the world. So there are still storytelling events happening. Hopefully Khal will talk about that. He does some himself. But storytelling is an important aspect of the California television culture.
So this evening, and recognizing that this is running parallel to Indigenous Peoples Day, and it was interesting. I was with some folks up in Amador County where I live on Friday. It was Friday evening, and somebody's they mentioned, oh yeah, it's your birthday's next Thursday. I said, yeah. She goes, yes, it's Columbus Day. I said, no, it's Indigenous Peoples Day. And so it's one of those changing our language, and just trying to just educate, very in a very supportive way. Just I didn't show my own tension and stress about being born on that day, but the sense that if we can change that language, and I think what we've tried to do today is just even the modeling. As we open today, for those of you who were here at the opening, in which we had Mary Tarango open, and she's from the local community here, doing just even the acknowledgement of the gift exchange, and what that means ceremonially, and to have Stacey and Mimi participate in this, that for us, it's something that we do, but what it means in terms of connecting with one another and trying to create something through all this, that we can move forward from this new place. So, these are all practices that we want to share. So with Indigenous Peoples Day happening concurrently, that after we have our lunch break, which will be down to the Redwood Room, and we're going to have our authors there. I'm going to ask Aldous to step up in a little bit to talk about his book. We're going to have Dr. Lorimer's book there, as well as what Gary has provided. We're looking at, in the afternoon, coming back here right after lunch, and then you'll be able to take away some games, activities, right, Calvin, and other information that you could take right into the classroom. After that, recommending please hang out. Sage LaPena is somebody I've actually quoted her in what I've written. I've never got to meet her in person, so it's just one of these. Yeah, we're always in different rooms or something. Yeah, we'll do that today. So between 3 and 4:15, we'll all go down to the ballroom to see Sage present. She has actually been tending the wild. It was recommended that we have that placed here. More than a word, this film will be shown later, and the people who put together this film are going to be here tonight. So if you're able to stick around, you'll be able to see this video as well. So right now, what I like to do is recognizing this is available to you now, okay? And you can pick and choose, you can use it all, but it's being handed to you. And people are saying, the Kumiai, the Ohlone, and so forth. Please use this material. This is what we want shared out with all of our children who are out here now. Yes?
Would you have any recommendations on finding local things for your own area? These are great, but then if you're not in that area, for third grade in particular, it doesn't take to be so much.
Yeah. So like what area are you talking about?
I'm here. I'm just actually a couple blocks from Sac Sage, right? So.
I would say, Al, you want to address that?
Well, if you could also, we have a representative in the state, and museum. Coming from the state? No, mine is. No.
Well, there's two of us here from the state.
So would you like to address that?
Hi, I'm Nancy Denner. I'm curator for Study Sport and the State of Agency, and Allison Parks is the
museum operations supervisor.
It's a state park.
Yeah, too many state terms. But
Anyway, I manage the operations. That's important to the museum and Nancy's our curator. And we are very interested in saying that I represent Study Sport and the State of Museum. I know that there's a lot of loaded history there. And we are very interested in updating, revising what we do at both places and integrating with going forward, like the schools are doing in the curriculum. So here's Alex.
Yeah, thank you. So there's your local resource, okay? Mr. Johnson, would you please come up for a second?
Oh, I'm just finding that just to call people at our This is Fort Sally Indian Reservation, which most of the children that I serve through Title VI are a part of. Also the Etna Rancheria, which Ruffy Rancheria, which is defunct, but there's a move to restore it. So I found that just forming relationships with the people in those communities, going to lunch together, asking questions, is the way that I've gotten, the most helpful tips on the direction in which I should probably be moving.
Thank you. Thank you. So just recognizing that this is just a beginning, and I know there were excellent questions put out here earlier about, I want to have more, what's okay to use, and so forth, and in getting through these sensitivities that do come up. And I can't remember, somebody said that sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but nonetheless, now we're having bigger strides because of you. You're the ones who are going to be out there in the classroom, and because of what you do, that makes a difference for the next generation. So we can sit here and talk and create and do websites all we want. However, if this isn't getting to the classroom, nothing changes, right? So with that, I want to add now that we have another layer when we start looking at the high school level in terms of change there. So I was fortunate to have 2 of my colleagues here, Dr. Allender and Dr. Berta-Avila, and Mr. Johnson, who's the tribal chair of the Nisanan. Yeah. Come on up. He's kind of shy, but yeah. So talking about their efforts with ethnic studies now and publication as well. No, you just, we're together, yeah. Give us updates and what's on the.
How you doing? Yeah. I'm Richard Johnson, Nevada City Rancheria Tribal Chairman, and of the Nishnawin Indians. So I was contacted. I have a talk I give on our website, nevadacity.rancheria.org, and that's became interesting to her and to Rose, and that's how I got involved and participated in this, and I support it very heavily. It's a good program. So basically that's it. I do give a lot of talks to schools. I talk to 3rd graders. Never realized how much energy they have. It's tough. And the schools in Grass Valley, Nevada City area use our website for some of the information. We're trying to get a lot more on it. I give PowerPoint presentations, so I'm hoping that we'll be adding more stuff so that local schools can be able to use more of this stuff at all levels. And basically that's it.
It's already afternoon, so good afternoon, everyone.
Yes.
Many blessings to all of you. I'm from here, Sacramento State. My family's from the King Nation in El Salvador, so indigenous from Central America communities. We wanted to just talk real quick, but Dale, do you want to?
Sure. I'm Dale Allender, also here from Sac State, office mates, colleagues, and co-leaders in the Ethnic Studies Now movement.
Right. So what I wanted to do is just share a little bit of an update, just a quick update on what's happening at the local and state level regarding ethnic studies, and then Dr. Allender will show more specifics of the curriculum. But really excited about the work overall that all of you are doing. I taught 3rd grade for several years, so I remember when it came to teaching 3rd grade and 4th grade, but especially 4th grade, teaching about the missions. I had to flip that all around, and at that time there was nothing to really support what I was doing. So this is just fabulous work that is going on, and as teachers out in the field, being able to use changes, even the standards that have been revised just a little bit to be able to really to say this is why I'm doing that, right? But anyways, I wanted to talk to you all just real quickly about the ethnic studies efforts here locally and as well as statewide. Here at Sacramento City Unified School District, 4 years ago, we were just talking about this yesterday, we started the work with the students at the forefront in pushing ethnic studies as a requirement at Sacramento City Unified School District. And the first year it passed in May of 2014. We had, 2015, we had the resolution that passed that was requiring all ninth graders to take ethnic studies. So since that point, we have been in transition here at Sacramento City Unified School District and slowly adding schools and classes. So as of now, we have almost all the high schools with the exception of 1 or 2 that will join us next academic year to have ethnic studies. And at each of the schools, each year, they are adding more classes to meet capacity of all the ninth graders at all of the schools. So some schools are more comprehensive, so that's going to take a little longer as far as the number of high school students that they have in ninth grade. And then we have also smaller schools that's a little more quick. The purpose of the ethnic studies movement that's happening not only here at Sacramento City Unified but across the state is very much aligned with what Dr. Borunda has been talking about, is to be able to offer, ironically or not ironically, the counter, but really what should not be the counter in our histories and in our stories and in what we're teaching. And it's to offer that environment and that voice of being able to understand institutionally what have been the structures that have played out to create equities, inequities, and have silenced communities, and how now it's time to put that forth. The research shows, and I don't want to go much into that because I know Dr. Allender will share more of that, but the research shows that students being able to have curriculum across the board that integrates who they are and gives them an opportunity to analyze where they're coming from and where they're going shows tremendous impact, not only as future civic citizens making change, but also academically. At the statewide level, there's a lot of movement that's happening. We've just passed last spring Assembly Bill 2016, which is looking to develop a model curriculum in ethnic studies. So these next couple of years, we are working at developing that model curriculum with ethnic studies professors, teachers, community members, and at the same time, districts are not waiting. Just like Sac City didn't wait, districts across the state are working towards passing resolutions that will then support this assembly bill. There's word out in the street, I'll just put it like that, that Assemblymember Medina is looking to put forth a ninth grade statewide requirement as well, which is different from the model curriculum. So there's a lot of movement that's happening. If you're interested in knowing more, you can definitely look at the Ethnic Studies Now website as well as the Ethnic Studies Now Sacramento here locally.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Berta-Avila, who has headed up the advocacy efforts for Ethnic Studies Now. I've fallen along the lines of the curriculum. Initially, we were all advocates. We got the resolution passed. The district looked to us and said there's no course of study, so we then divided ourselves into committees. And I worked with a number of folks to develop a course of study. We listed out a tremendous number of resources that should be read and viewed and listened to, and the district said, we can't buy all of that, so they said, you got to give us a textbook. So there's no ethnic studies textbook out there right now that reflects the local ethnic communities, let alone the indigenous communities in this immediate region. So we put together a textbook. First version of that was used last fall and last spring at Sac City Unified. But we put together the textbook with an agreement with the publisher that we would do 3 iterations of the book. And each time we were ready to do a new version, we would go to the students, we would go to the community, and we would get feedback on the book. So we did that the first time in this past December and came out with our second version of the book. In the next few weeks, we'll be doing the same thing. And so we keep adding on it. We're not leaving material behind. The lead article is still the one written by, I should say co-written, right, by Dr. Borunda and Crystal Martinez-Alire, California History, Depth and Breadth for Original American Indian Tribal Nations Beyond a Mere 250 Years. There are also other chapters in there looking at NAGPRA, also looking at legislation around mascot use and so forth. Other chapters in the book that don't deal explicitly, immediately with indigenous communities in the area talk about the relationship between other ethnic communities and various indigenous communities in the area. So we're very, very excited about the book. We have flyers here for those of you who would like to examine it further. I can say that you'll receive this and you'll get a real nice textbook, but the following year will be even more robust. In addition to that, we're providing a professional development for the district. I'd like to make an unofficial announcement that we just received a grant to be able to increase the number of teachers who will receive professional development and curricular resources in ethnic studies. Thank you. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I know there are others to speak, but we look forward to having it out there in the world and you enjoying the book.
And if I can just add one last point real quickly regarding what Dr. Allender shared about teachers. Right now in the state of California, we only have, at the high school level, a social science credential. So anybody under social science can teach ethnic studies or teach specific courses related to community groups and not necessarily have the discipline background for that. So there's a big movement that we're in right now, especially here at Sacramento State, where we are pushing for social science waivers through ethnic studies departments and also developing a co-joint effort of an ethnic studies certificate for teachers who are already out in the field and might have like an ethnic studies discipline background or other specific, like I was a Chicanx major at UC Davis, so have different backgrounds, and then be able to take those courses and have that discipline background. So one of the messages that we're putting out there is that we need the teachers that have the conscious mindedness of what this work is about. And so if you know individuals, please send them our way. These are some of the efforts that we're working on as well. All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day in solidarity with you always. Thank you.
The people registered, I know that some of you were, junior high school age. So again, what we have out there for you in terms of resources and the efforts being made at this time. I love the opening quote, and I just have to share it because it was such a beautiful quote from Mr. Johnson. The most important thing that people, thank you, Dale, that people need to know about the Nisenan people is that we are still here. And I love that persistence, and I love the resilience in that. The other thing that needs to be known is that we need to correct the history books. The history books have it wrong. And, as we know that there's been a number of elders who have tried this before and have not been able to get through the bureaucracy and perhaps the politics of it. So that's why when we have the resources that people from the communities are saying, here you go, it's for you to take. So we do have the authors sitting down in the Redwood room available to you. We have the resources we have set here. We have Calvin, who's going to provide more this afternoon, that will get his information on the website. Just know that people are taking notice and that your lunch is provided by the California Teachers Association. Ricardo Torres made a connection for us and stepped in to provide your lunch for today. So that's on the first floor, across from Eco Cafe, Eco Map.
Yeah, it's the Redwood room, and I was down there, and it's ready for us.